What if the most famous king in history never existed? Imagine a library, vast and filled with towering shelves, dedicated to one man. There are books of poetry, epic novels, films, paintings, and dense scholarly works, all cataloging his life, his nights, his love, his betrayal, and his final tragic battle. Now imagine walking to the very center of that library, to the section marked Contemporary Evidence, and finding only a single empty shelf. This is the strange, unsettling mystery of King Arthur. He is everywhere, and yet, in the one place he should be, the history written by those who lived during his supposed lifetime, he is gone. He is a ghost, a rumor, a king built not of flesh and blood, but of memory and longing. Tonight, we are going to chase that ghost, not to debunk him, but to understand why he is the most powerful king who may never have ruled. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As you settle in, feel free to post your location and your local time in the comments. It's always a quiet comfort to see where everyone is listening from, forming a small, peaceful community in the late hours of the night. That question, however, still hangs in the quiet air. Was he real? The answer, like all things in the deep past, is a frustrating, beautiful, and resounding maybe. To find him, we must leave the shining walls of Camelot, strip away the armor, and put down the magical swords. We must travel back, far back, not to the high Middle Ages of knights and tournaments, but to the grim, chaotic, and muddy twilight of Roman Britain. The world Arthur was supposedly born into wasn't one of chivalry. It was a world of collapse. Imagine Britain in the 5th century. The last Roman legions, those symbols of order, bureaucracy, and paved roads, had packed up and left around the year 410. They were recalled to defend a dying empire, and they never came back. What they left behind was a society suddenly exposed, like a hermit crab pulled from its shell. The remaining Romanized Britons, accustomed to central heating, mosaic floors, and a military that handled the barbarian problem, were now on their own. From the east came the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, sailing across the North Sea in longships. From the north came the Picts, and from the west, the Irish. It was, to put it mildly, a terrible time to be alive. The infrastructure crumbled. Villas were abandoned, their intricate floors slowly covered by moss and mud. Cities emptied out, life expectancy plummeted. This wasn't an age of soaring castles. It was an age of hastily rebuilt Iron Age hill forts, of wooden stockades slick with rain, of warlords gathering small bands of warriors, called comitatus, bound by oaths of loyalty and the promise of plunder. This is the world that needed an Arthur. Mainstream historical fact tells us this. The period of Arthur's supposed reign, roughly the late 5th to early 6th century, is known as the Dark Ages for a reason. Not because the people were ignorant, but because they left us almost no written records. The administrative machinery of Rome was gone, and the new Saxon kingdoms hadn't yet developed their own robust literacy. The few chroniclers who were writing were monks, and they weren't interested in a secular warlord's exploits. They were interested in sin, salvation, and the frightening end of the world. This brings us to our first great historiographic mystery, our first empty shelf. There was a monk, a very angry and eloquent monk named Gildas, who lived during this exact period. Around the 540s, he wrote a blistering sermon called De Excidio et Conquistu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain. He complains about everything: the faithless people, the invading Saxons, and the selfish, tyrannical local kings. And in this text, he mentions a great climactic battle, the Battle of Mons Badonicus, or Mount Badon. This was the battle, he says, where the Britons finally turned the tide, smashing the Saxon advance and winning a generation of peace. It is the single most important battle of the age. It is, in all later legends, Arthur's 12th and most glorious victory. And yet, Gildas, the man who was there, the only contemporary source we have, never once mentions the name Arthur. He attributes the victory not to a heroic commander, but to the will of God, and perhaps to another man, a Roman Briton leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus. This silence is deafening. It's like writing a history of the Battle of Waterloo and forgetting to mention Napoleon or Wellington. It is the central problem of the historical Arthur. If he was the High King, the commander of all British forces, the man who saved the entire island, how could the one person writing about his greatest victory possibly leave his name out? This is where the hypotheses begin, whispered in the corridors of university history departments. Perhaps, some say, Arthur was there, but he wasn't a king. The concept of a single High King of all Britain was probably an anachronism, a fantasy projected backward by later writers. Perhaps he was simply a dux bellorum, a duke of battles, a professional mobile cavalry commander. Maybe he was a brutish, effective, and deeply unchristian man, the kind a pious monk like Gildas would pointedly ignore, even while celebrating his victory. Or perhaps Arthur wasn't even a name. Some have suggested it was a title derived from the Roman family name Artorius, or maybe even from Artos, the Brythonic word for bear. He could have been the Bear, a terrifying warrior whose real name is lost to us, a man whose legend grew so large it eventually consumed the man himself. This is the hard, gold ground upon which the legend is built. There is no contemporary proof. There is only a profound need for a hero. The Britons were losing. Their language, their culture, and their religion were being pushed back, inch by inch, toward the western mountains of Wales and Cornwall. They were watching their world dissolve. In such desperate times, people don't just tell stories. They forge them as a kind of cultural weapon. They needed a symbol of defiance, a memory of a time they won. They needed a leader who wasn't just another petty tyrant, but a true Roman Briton, a Christian hero, a giant who could stand against the storm. And so, from the damp earth of this ruined province, a seed began to grow. It wasn't a story of a king in a shining castle, not yet. It was a darker, stranger, and far more magical story, whispered in the Welsh language around peat fires, tales of a warrior who fought giants, who hunted magical boars, and who, perhaps, had never truly died. The historical Arthur may be a ghost, but the legendary Arthur was just being born. That seed of a story, planted in the damp, desperate soil of 5th century Britain, took root first in the very places the Saxons had not yet conquered: the mountainous, rain-swept west and the rugged north. It was whispered in Brythonic, the ancestor of modern Welsh, a language that crackled with magic and loss. For centuries, this Arthur was not a king of all England. He was a Welsh hero, a protector, and something far stranger than just a man. The Romans were gone, their libraries mouldering. The new invaders were largely illiterate. The only records of this hero, the only hints that he was more than a campfire tale, survived in the margins of manuscripts and the stanzas of mournful poetry, copied and recopied by monks who were preserving a history they themselves were beginning to see as ancient. If we want to find the first ghost of Arthur in the written record, we must travel to the kingdom of Gododin, in what is now southern Scotland, around the year 600. The text is not a history, but a poem, one of the oldest in the Welsh language, Why Gododin. It is an elegy, a long, heartbreaking lament for a war band of 300 elite British warriors. They gathered, as the poem tells, for a year of feasting and drinking in the mead hall of their king at Dyn Eidyn, what we now call Edinburgh. They were building their courage for a suicidal charge against a vastly superior Saxon army at a place called Cattraeth, or modern Catterick. The poem is a series of short, vivid verses, each one remembering a different warrior who feasted in the hall and then died on the battlefield. It praises their fine clothes, their bravery, their loyalty. And in the verse for a warrior named Gwadr, the poet Aneurin writes that he fed the black ravens on the ramparts of the fortress, that he was a force of nature. But, the poet adds, he was no Arthur. This single, casual line is electrifying. It is not a story about Arthur. It's a comparison, a drop mic moment from the 7th century. The poet, trying to find the highest possible praise for his fallen hero, reaches for the ultimate benchmark of warrior prowess and says, look, he was incredible, though, let's be honest, he wasn't Arthur. This tells us something profound. It tells us that by the year 600, or at least by the time this poem was written down, Arthur's name was already legendary. He was the gold standard. He was the hero all other heroes were measured against. This is not proof of a historical king, but it is solid proof of a powerful, widespread myth existing far earlier than many once believed. He was the name you whispered when you wanted to describe a warrior who was almost impossibly brave, a true giant of the battlefield. But a name in a poem is not a history. For that, we must wait another 200 years. The silence is finally and spectacularly broken around the year 830 by a Welsh monk traditionally known as Nennius. He compiled a text, a strange and wonderful mess of a book called the Historia Brittonum, or History of the Britons. It's less a history in the modern sense and more of a passionate, chaotic, and patriotic scrapbook. Nennius gathered oral traditions, scraps of king lists, biblical genealogies, and fragments of Roman records, stitching them all together in a desperate attempt to create a narrative for a people who felt they were losing theirs. And in chapter 56 of this book, he gives us the first ever biography of our hero. He writes that after the death of the Saxon leader Hengist, Arthur fought against them in those days, together with the kings of the Britons, but he himself was the dux bellorum. This is a critical distinction. Nennius, remember, is Welsh. He doesn't call Arthur a rex, a king. That title belonged to the various petty kings of the Welsh kingdoms. Arthur is something else, something more Roman, more professional, the Duke of Battles, or perhaps commander of the armies. This fits perfectly with the fragmented post-Roman world we imagined earlier. Arthur isn't sitting on a throne, he's on horseback. He's a mobile, charismatic, and terrifyingly effective general, the man the squabbling local kings turn to when the Saxon threat becomes too great. Nennius then does something that will define the legend forever. He gives us a list. He provides the 12 great battles Arthur fought. This is the first time we move from a vague "he was a hero" to a concrete set of supposed historical events. The names are archaic and misty. The first battle was at the mouth of the river Glein. 4 more were on another river called Dubglas. The 6th was on the river Bassas. The 7th in the forest of Celadon, a name that echoes with ancient magic. And then Nennius names the 12th and final battle, Mons Badonicus, Mount Baden. The very same battle that the monk Gildas, our silent contemporary, had described. But where Gildas was silent, Nennius is clear. Arthur was there. And he wasn't just at the battle. He was the battle. Nennius adds a stunning superhuman detail, in which Arthur, on that one day, killed 960 men in a single charge, and no one laid them low save he himself. This is the legend inflating, moving from greatest warrior in Y. Gododin to a demigod in Nennius. He is also, crucially, a Christian hero. Nennius claims Arthur bore the image of the Virgin Mary on his shield, or, in a famous mistranslation, his shoulders, and it was through her power and Christ's that he won. The historical mystery here is immense. Where were these 12 battles? Historians and amateur sleuths have been trying to pin them on a map for centuries, with almost no consensus. The names are too old, too vague. Klein could be any of a dozen rivers. The forest of Celadon is simply the ancient name for the wild forests of lowland Scotland. This list, some historians hypothesize, may not be the biography of a single man. It might be a bardic poem, a greatest hits of British victories, a collection of all the successful battles fought against the Saxons over a 50-year period, which Nennius, in his patriotic fervor, found and attributed to a single unifying hero. A few years later, another document, the Annals Cambria, or Welsh Annals, adds 2 more tantalizing, tragic details. These annals are just a dry, terse list of events, jotted down year by year. Under the entry for what corresponds to 516 AD, the anonymous monk writes, "The Battle of Baden, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were victors." This confirms Nennius's story, adding that the battle lasted 3 days. But then, under the year 537 AD, it adds a new chilling entry. The Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell, and there was plague in Britain and Ireland. Here it is, the first mention of his final battle, the first mention of Medrawd, the man who will become Mordred, and the first mention of his death. It's not a glorious end, but a stark, bleak statement. He fell. This is the bedrock of the legend. This is the Arthur of the Dark Ages. Not a king, but a general. Not a man of chivalry, but a brutal and effective warrior. He is pious, superhumanly strong, and ultimately mortal. He is a figure of victory and of tragic, unresolved loss. He is the man the Welsh bards will sing of for the next 300 years. A figure of magic, a giant slayer, a man who, perhaps, never really died. But even as these Welsh tales grew, the greatest, most confounding mystery remained: the silence of the one man who should have known him. But now we must pause. We have these tantalizing, gritty fragments from the later Welsh sources, remember? We have the poet of Y. Gododin name-dropping Arthur as the ultimate warrior. We have the Annales Cambriae giving us that stark, tragic dateline for his death at Camlan. And most importantly, We have Nennius, that passionate 9th century collector, giving us the Dux Bellorum and his 12 superhuman battles, culminating in the 960 men he supposedly slew by his own hand at Mount Bodden. These sources, written hundreds of years after the fact, are loud, they are certain, they are building a hero, and yet we must now confront the ghost at the feast. We must return to that empty shelf in the library, to the one man who was there, the man who lived through the very battles Nennius would later describe. His silence is the central, maddening, and most fascinating mystery of the entire legend. His name was Gildas. To understand Gildas, you have to understand that he was not a historian. He was, to put it in modern terms, the author of the angriest complaint letter ever written. Sometime around the 540s AD, while the peace won at Mount Bodden still held, Gildas, a Romano-British monk, sat down in his scriptorium, likely somewhere in the safe, unconquered west of Britain, and dipped his pen in pure, unadulterated fury. His book, De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, On the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, is not a calm recounting of facts. It is a Jeremiad. It's a fire and brimstone sermon, screaming at the kings and clergy of his own time, accusing them of being so corrupt, so sinful, and so weak that they were squandering the peace God had granted them. He opens with a history, not for history's sake, but to set the stage for his complaint. He describes the Romans leaving. He paints a terrifying, visceral picture of the Saxon invasions, of flames crackling from sea to sea, of cities smashed, of altars stained with the blood of priests, of Britons fleeing to the mountains like senseless sheep. He is a man who has lived through, or just after, a societal collapse, and he is traumatized by it. He tells us that the Britons, in their desperation, finally began to fight back, and he gives credit to a specific leader, a man named Ambrosius Aurelianus. Gildas calls him a man of modesty, and most importantly, perhaps the last of the Romans. Here was a man Gildas could respect, a blue-blooded, civilized Roman aristocrat, not some rough-edged local warlord. Under Ambrosius's leadership, Gildas says, the Britons began to win. The war ebbed and flowed until it reached its climax. And here, we hold our breath. Gildas describes the siege of the Baden Hill, the last but not the least of their slaughters. This battle, he confirms, was a total crushing victory for the Britons. It wasn't just a skirmish. It was the event that stopped the Saxon advance cold. He says it brought a generation of peace, a peace that had lasted, by his count, 44 years and 1 month, up to the very day he was writing. This is it. This is the battle Nennius gave to Arthur. This is the linchpin of the entire historical legend. And in his description of this battle, the most important victory of the age, Gildas mentions no one. He doesn't name the commander. He doesn't name a single hero. He gives the credit to God's divine will. He names Ambrosius Aurelianus as the man who started the resistance. But he pointedly does not connect him to this final victory. And the name Arthur is nowhere to be found. Not once. Not in the entire, lengthy, furious book. This is the great void. This is the problem. It is not just that he doesn't mention him. It's that he describes Arthur's single greatest supposed achievement and gives him zero credit for it. How is this possible? The historical hypotheses branch out like cracks in ice. The first and simplest is the most brutal. Arthur did not exist. He was a folk hero from a different region, or a later invention entirely, and Nennius, centuries later, simply stole the anonymous victory at Badon and stamped Arthur's name on it to glorify his hero. In this view, the real hero, if there was one, was Ambrosius, the man Gildas did name. The second hypothesis is more subtle. Perhaps Arthur was there, but he was not the supreme commander. Remember, Gildas was a bit of a snob, obsessed with Romanness. He loved Ambrosius for being the last of the Romans. Perhaps Arthur was a dux bellorum, a rough and tumble, non-aristocratic cavalry specialist, fighting under Ambrosius's command. Gildas, writing his history, might have only bothered to name the respectable, high-born general, ignoring the thuggish bear who did the actual wet work. The third hypothesis is the most dramatic. Gildas knew exactly who Arthur was, and he hated him. Gildas's book is, after all, a furious attack on the tyrants of his own day, 5 British kings whom he names and shames, calling one the tyrannical whelp and another the dragon of the island. What if Arthur was one of them, or the father of one of them? What if, in Gildas's mind, Arthur wasn't the savior of Britain, but the start of the new, corrupt, post-Roman order he so despised? Perhaps Arthur was a warlord who carved out his own kingdom from the chaos, a man Gildas saw as no better than the Saxons he fought. To pointedly erase him from the victory at Badon would have been the ultimate monkish insult, a deliberate damnatio memoriae. We simply do not know. This silence is a blank canvas, a frustrating, perfect vacuum. But in history, a vacuum never lasts. It begs to be filled. And into this specific gaping hole left by Gildas, the man who was actually there, a whole new story would grow. That is the silence. That is the vacuum. And into that vacuum, as we have already seen, a man named Nennius would eventually speak, gathering the campfire stories and bardic boasts to finally give the victory a name. He was correcting the record, filling the void that Gildas had left, and in doing so, he was transforming a rumor into a legend, into the void left by Gildas. That vast, echoing silence steps a man with a story. We must now journey forward in time, leaving the 6th century for the 9th, to a world where the Saxon kingdoms are now firmly established. The Britons, pushed into Wales and the West, are a people living on the margins, holding onto their language and their memories. And in this world, around the year 830, a Welsh monk, or perhaps a committee of monks, known to us only as Nennius, sits down to write. He is not a dispassionate scholar. He is a collector, a patriot, and perhaps a bit of a propagandist. The book he compiles is the Historia Brittonum, the history of the Britons, and it is one of the most wonderfully chaotic and important documents of the Dark Ages. It is not a history as we would know it, all neat timelines and objective analysis. It's a scrapbook, a passionate jumble of genealogies tracing the Welsh kings back to the Romans and even to Troy, snippets of local geography, tales of saints, and most crucially, a collection of oral traditions. Nennius is on a mission to gather all the scattered threads of his people's past and weave them into a single, proud narrative. He is writing to answer the silence of Gildas, to shout back against the new history being written by his conquerors, the Saxons. He wants to prove that the Britons, too, had a heroic past. And in this book, he gives us the first ever resume for King Arthur. It appears in chapter 56, and it begins with a crucial, careful choice of words. Nennius writes that after the Saxons arrived, in those days Arthur fought against them, together with the kings of the Britons, but he himself was Dux Bellorum. He was the Duke of Battles, or warlord. This is a profoundly important detail. Nennius, remember, is writing for those very Welsh kings. He is careful not to call Arthur a rex, a king, which might have offended his royal patrons. Instead, he gives him a title that sounds Roman, professional, and mobile. Arthur isn't a man sitting on a throne in a fixed capital. He's a commander on horseback, a specialist in war, the man the disparate, squabbling British kings turned to when the crisis was at its peak. This description feels authentic. It fits the broken, militarized, post-Roman world we explored earlier. A world of local leaders hiring a professional to do the hard, bloody work of defense. Then Nennius gives us the list. It is the moment the legend snaps into focus, moving from a vague heroic reputation that he was no Arthur line from Wygododin to a concrete set of supposed historical events. He gives us 12 battles. This list has haunted historians for over 1,000 years because the names are so strange, so archaic, so profoundly lost. They sound less like battlefields and more like locations from a half-remembered dream. The first battle, he says, was at the mouth of the river Glein. The second, third, fourth, and fifth were on another river, the Douglas, in the region of Linuis. The sixth was on the river Bassas. The seventh was in the forest of Celidon, a name that echoes with ancient pre-Roman magic, the Caledonian forest of Scotland. The eighth was at the fortress of Ginion, the ninth in the city of the Legion, the 10th on the banks of the river Tribrut, the 11th on the mountain called Agned, and then the 12th, the climax, the Battle of Mount Badon. Here, Nennius takes the anonymous victory that Gildas described and gives it a hero. And not just a hero, but a superhuman one. He adds a detail that is pure, uncut legend, a boast from a bardic hall, not a historian study, in which, Nennius writes, on that one day, 960 men fell in one charge of Arthur, and no one laid them low, save he himself. This is not a man. This is a force of nature. This is a folk-tale hero, a giant slayer, a figure of myth who has just punched his way into the historical record. To make this hero palatable to his Christian audience, Nennius also adds that Arthur was a pious champion, claiming he bore the image of the Holy Virgin Mary on his shield. Thus, the pagan-slaying warlord is also a soldier of Christ, his victories a sign of God's favor. But this list presents our great historiographic mystery. Where are these places? The short answer is, nobody knows. For centuries, scholars and enthusiasts have tried to pin them on a map, but the names are too generic or too ancient. Glein could be any river glen. Douglas just means black water. The city of the Legion could be Chester or Caerleon. This very unmappability has led to the dominant hypothesis. This list of 12 battles was never a biography in the first place. It is almost certainly a pre-existing piece of Welsh heroic poetry, a battle list that Nennius found and simply copied into his Historia. The structure, the repetitive river names, the mythic locations like the forest of Celidon, it all feels like a bard's song, a greatest hits of British victories that were over time all attributed to the one hero whose name outshone all others. This is how a legend is built. Nennius acted as a bridge. He took the shadowy heroic name Arthur that was floating in the oral traditions of Wales, and he attached it to the single most important event of the 5th century, the great tide-turning anonymous victory at Mount Bodden. He took the ghost that Gildas had ignored and gave him a body, a title, Dux Bellorum, and a staggering, impossible kill count. He wasn't inventing Arthur from nothing. He was compiling him, gathering the fragments of bardic song, folk memory, and Christian piety, and forging them into a single, coherent figure. He filled the empty shelf, and in doing so, he set the stage for everything that was to come. He ensured that this Arthur, this warlord, this demigod, would not be forgotten. The foundation was now laid, firm and deep, ready for the next, even stranger, set of storytellers to build upon. While Nennius was busy carving his Dux Bellorum into the official record, anchoring him to the real victory at Mount Bodden, another Arthur was thriving. This Arthur was wilder, older, and infinitely stranger. He lived not in dusty Latin histories, but in the crackle of the bard's voice, in the smoke of the mead hall, in the ancient Welsh stories that had been passed down orally for generations. This wasn't a pious Christian general burdened with saving a nation. This was a giant slayer, a raider of the otherworld, and the chieftain of a band of heroes so bizarre they make a modern superhero team look mundane. To find this Arthur, we must step out of the monastery and into the magic-saturated landscape of pre-Norman Wales. These stories, eventually written down in the 13th and 14th centuries in manuscripts like the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hergest, are what we now collectively call the Mabinogion. But the tales themselves are far, far older. The most important one for us, and perhaps the oldest, is the dazzling, chaotic, and utterly brilliant tale of Culhwch and Olwen. This story gives us the clearest snapshot of the Welsh Arthur before he was repackaged for a new European audience. The story begins, and we are immediately in a different universe from Nennius's. A young hero, Culhwch, arrives at Arthur's court. His cruel stepmother has cursed him so that he can marry no one except Olwen, the beautiful daughter of Isbaddaden, the chief of all giants. Culhwch arrives at Arthur's hall, not a shining castle, but a fortified, smoky, feasting hall. The gatekeeper is fearsome, and he refuses to let Culhwch in, stating that the feast has begun. Culhwch, in a fit of aristocratic rage, threatens to give 3 great shouts that will make every pregnant woman in the land miscarry. This is not the polite chivalric world of later romance. This is raw, primal, and mythic. Arthur, hearing the commotion, overrules his gatekeeper and lets his young cousin in. And it is here that we see Arthur's true role in this tradition. He is not the main character. He is not the questing hero. He is the central, immovable pillar around which all heroes revolve. He is the man who makes the impossible possible. Culhwch asks Arthur for a boon, to get him Olwen, and he invokes the names of Arthur's warriors, asking for the boon in their names. This list, the Anraithiau Arthur, or Arthur's treasures, is a jaw-dropping roster of his court. It is not a list of knights in shining armor. It is a list of freaks and demigods. There is Kai, Sir Kay, who can hold his breath for 9 days and 9 nights, who can go 9 days without sleep, and whose hands are so hot that in the rain, anything he holds remains perfectly dry. There is Bedwyr, Sir Bedivere, who is one-handed, but is still the most handsome man in the kingdom, and whose spear creates a wound equal to 9. There are men who can run on the tops of trees, men who can drink the entire sea, men who can hear an ant stirring 50 miles away. This is Arthur's Comitatus, his war band. It is not a historical army. It is a collection of mythological archetypes. Arthur, bound by honor, agrees to help his cousin. He and his bizarre band of heroes travel to Isbadaden's fortress. The giant, a terrifying figure whose eyelids must be propped up with forks, agrees to give his daughter to Kaluch if they can complete a list of 40 impossible tasks, or and with how. And this is the great mystery and wonder of the tale. The rest of the story is not about Kulch winning his bride. It's about Arthur and his superhuman gang working their way through this impossible checklist. Like a divine project manager, the tasks are not chivalric. They are not jousts or duels. They are mythological labors. They must plow a field in one day, which requires them to find 2 magical oxen. To control the oxen, they need a specific harness. To get the harness, they must find a magical smith, and on and on. The most famous task is the hunt for the Turk Trith, a giant, venomous magical boar who was once a king. The hunt rages across all of Wales, Ireland, and Cornwall. It is an epic, violent, and geographical myth, explaining the origins of place names as the boar rampages. This is the mainstream fact of the Welsh tradition. Arthur is a mythological hero chieftain. His primary legend, a great magical boar hunt. This is a profoundly different man from the Dux Bellorum. But this isn't even the strangest part of his pre-Geoffrey legend. An even older, more cryptic poem, Preidu Onhun, The Spoils of Anne, gives us an even darker Arthur. Onhun is the Welsh otherworld, a paradise, a land of feasting, but also a place of dread. The poem, narrated by the bard Taliesin, describes a disastrous expedition led by Arthur. They travel in Arthur's magical ship, Prydwen, to the otherworld, to a fortress of glass, to steal a magical cauldron. This cauldron is the source of all plenty. It will not cook food for a coward, and it is warmed by the breath of 9 maidens. This is not a Christian quest. This is a pre-Christian raid on the land of the gods, a theme common to Celtic mythology. The expedition is a catastrophe. Taliesin reports that 3 shiploads went, and except for 7, none returned. Here the historiographic mystery deepens. Which Arthur is the real one? Is it Nennius's pious Christian general? Or is it this pagan raider, this chieftain of monsters, this leader of a great mythological boar hunt? The hypothesis that emerges is a powerful one. Perhaps this magical Arthur is the original. Perhaps Arthur was never a man at all. Perhaps he was an ancient British god, a bear god, Artos, a figure of cult and worship, the protector of the island. Over time, as Christianity spread, the old gods were demoted. They became heroes, giants, and in Arthur's case, a heroic chieftain. This hero, this once and future king of the Welsh imagination, was then historicized. Nennius, hearing the tales of this great hero of the past, simply took this mythological figure and slotted him into the historical gap left by Gildas, attaching his famous name to the real historical Battle of Baden. By the early 11th century, these 2 streams were flowing in parallel. For the Latin-reading monks, there was Arthur the Dux Bellorum, the Christian savior. For the Welsh-speaking bards, there was Arthur the magical chieftain, the raider of the otherworld. He was both a man and a myth, a historical shadow, and a magical giant. And these 2 powerful, contradictory ideas were just waiting for one man, a brilliant, ambitious, and wildly imaginative cleric, to slam them together and create the king we think we know today. That man was Geoffrey of Monmouth, and the world he was born into, around 1100, was a world of profound political and cultural upheaval. The Norman conquest of 1066 had torn Anglo-Saxon England apart, replacing its aristocracy with a new French-speaking elite. This new, aggressive, and incredibly ambitious Anglo-Norman ruling class found themselves in control of an island, but they lacked a national story for it. They had the history of the Normans, and the Anglo-Saxons had their own chronicles. But what about the island of Britain itself? They needed an origin story, a grand, sweeping epic that could legitimize their rule and stand shoulder to shoulder with the great epics of Rome, like Virgil's Aeneid. They needed a hero of their own, a British Alexander, a British Charlemagne. Geoffrey of Monmouth, an ambitious cleric with Welsh connections, saw this cultural vacuum and decided to fill it himself. And he did it with such breathtaking audacity that it changed Western literature forever. Around the year 1136, Geoffrey produced a book with a deceptively simple title, Historia Regum Britanniae, or The History of the Kings of Britain. It was written in elegant scholarly Latin, the international language of power and truth. And in his preface, Geoffrey made a claim that is the single greatest historiographic mystery of his age. He claimed that he wasn't writing this history at all. Oh no. He was, he said, merely translating a certain very ancient book in the British tongue, given to him by his friend Walter, the Archdeacon of Oxford. This book, he claimed, contained the full, lost history of all the kings who had ruled Britain, from Brutus of Troy, a supposed descendant of Aeneas, all the way down to the last Welsh kings. This ancient book has obsessed scholars for centuries. Was it real? Did Geoffrey have a secret, lost Welsh source that contained all these stories? The overwhelming consensus, the mainstream fact, is a resounding no. No trace of such a book has ever been found. No other writer ever mentions it. It was almost certainly a brilliant fabrication, a clever piece of scholarly window dressing, a rhetorical device to give his own creation the unassailable authority of ancient history. Geoffrey, in essence, was telling the medieval equivalent of, "My uncle, who works at Nintendo, told me," and what a story he told. He took the existing scattered and contradictory threads of Arthur and wove them into a grand, seamless, and utterly compelling tapestry. He took the Dux Bellorum from Nennius, the man who fought 12 battles. He took the magical, otherworldly elements from Welsh folklore, like the hint of a magical birth and a journey to a mystical island. He took the name of the final battle, Cam Lan, from the Annales Cambriae. And then, from his own towering imagination, he built a kingdom. The most important thing Geoffrey did was to promote Arthur. In the Historia Regum Britannia, Arthur is not a Dux Bellorum, a warlord, fighting with the kings of Britain. He is the king. He is the unchallenged High King of all Britain. Geoffrey gives him a detailed, tragic, and magical lineage, which we will explore later, involving his father, Uther Pendragon, and the wizardry of a new, central character named Merlin. He gives him a wife, Guinevere, whom he describes as the most beautiful woman in the island, descended from a noble Roman family. He gives him a court, a capital, and a clear linear biography. But Geoffrey's Arthur is not just a local king fending off Saxons. That, in Geoffrey's grand vision, is just the beginning. A brief episode in Arthur's youth. Once Arthur has united Britain, he casts his eyes abroad. This is Geoffrey's grand invention. He turns the defensive warlord of Nennius into a pan-European conqueror. Arthur, in this new history, is an emperor. He is an aggressive, expansionist, and terrifyingly successful military genius. He first conquers Ireland, then Iceland, then Gothland, and the Orkneys. He defeats the King of Norway and the King of Denmark. He then turns his attention to the continent and, in a 9-year campaign, conquers all of Gaul, France. He returns to Britain and establishes a court of such splendor and civility that it attracts the greatest heroes from all corners of the world. This is the first faint echo of chivalry. But the story is not over. At the height of his power, as he holds a Pentecostal feast at his capital, the city of the Legion, a message arrives. It is from Lucius Tiberius, the fictional emperor of Rome, and it is a demand. Britain must pay tribute to Rome, as it had in the days of Julius Caesar. Arthur's response is, essentially, to laugh. He makes a counterclaim. Britain, he argues, had ancient claims to Rome, not the other way around. He gathers a vast army, British, Irish, Scottish, Norwegian, Danish, and French, and invades the continent to challenge the Roman Empire itself. He fights a war of giants and monsters, culminating in a colossal, apocalyptic battle against Lucius's forces. Arthur is, of course, victorious. He kills the Emperor Lucius, and he makes plans to march on Rome and be crowned Emperor of the West. This is the King Geoffrey invented. A warrior emperor on the verge of conquering the known world. And it is only here, at this absolute pinnacle of his glory, that Geoffrey introduces the tragic flaw. Just as he is about to cross the Alps, news comes from Britain. His nephew, Mordred, whom he had left in charge, has committed treason. He has seized the crown, and in a detail that would scandalize and fascinate audiences for centuries, has traitorously and incestuously taken Queen Guinevere as his own. Arthur is forced to abandon his Roman conquest and return home. The final act is swift and tragic. He fights Mordred at the River Camel in Cornwall. It is the Battle of Camlan, but now it is not a misty battle against Saxons. It is a heartbreaking civil war. Mordred is slain, but Arthur, as Geoffrey writes, is mortally wounded. And then Geoffrey gives us the final crucial piece of the puzzle. Arthur is carried to the Isle of Avalon so that his wounds might be healed. He does not say Arthur died. He says he was taken away to be healed. And in a later work, his Prophecies of Merlin, he would add the final tantalizing line. His end, Merlin prophesies, shall be a matter of doubt. With that one ambiguous sentence, Geoffrey of Monmouth created the once and future king. He had taken a folk hero and made him a global emperor. He had taken a pile of scattered fragments and built a national epic. His Historia was an immediate, explosive international blockbuster. It was translated into French, into Welsh, into English. For the next 500 years, it was not considered legend. It was, without question, history. But in building his grand political stage, Geoffrey had left gaps. He had created a court full of knights, but he hadn't told their stories. He had created a love triangle, but he hadn't explored its heart. He had built the theater, and now the story was ready for the next act, the arrival of chivalry, romance, and Lancelot. But Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his grand act of literary forgery, his Historia Regum Britannia, wasn't just building a political empire for Arthur. He was also, simultaneously, writing the origin story for the man who would make that empire possible. An epic hero king, after all, needs an epic-level advisor, a man who can bend the rules of reality itself. Geoffrey needed a character who could stand outside of history, who could see the threads of fate, and who could pull them. He found this figure not in the pages of history, but in the wild, misty folklore of his native Wales. And he gave him a new name, Merlin. Merlin's entrance into the story is pure theatrical folklore, a masterpiece of tension and supernatural dread. Geoffrey sets the stage not with Arthur, but with the weak, usurping King Vortigern, the man Gildas had also complained about. Vortigern, in Geoffrey's telling, is trying to build a great fortress, a citadel at Dinas Emrys in the mountains of Snowdonia, to hide from the Saxon armies he had foolishly invited into Britain. But the fortress will not stand. Every night, the stones his men have laid all day, they just collapse. The foundations swallow the work again and again. Vortigern, desperate and terrified, summons his magicians, his old-school pagan druids. Their solution is, to say the least, rather dark. They tell the king that the only way to make the foundation hold is to consecrate it with the blood of a boy who had no father. This is a classic ancient folk motif, the foundation sacrifice. Royal messengers are dispatched across Britain to find this impossible child. Eventually, in the town of Carmarthen, they find him. They find a boy named Merlin, or in Welsh, Myrddin. His mother, a virtuous nun, swears an oath that she was visited in the night by a spirit, an incubus, a being from another world, and that this spirit is the boy's father. This origin story is a masterstroke. Merlin is instantly defined as a liminal being, caught between the human world and the world of magic, belonging to neither and to both. The boy is dragged before Vortigern, destined to be a ritual sacrifice. But when Merlin stands before the king and his cowering magicians, he doesn't plead for his life. He laughs, he mocks them. He tells Vortigern that his magicians are fools, that they have no idea why the tower is collapsing. And then, this child, filled with an ancient, unearthly knowledge, reveals the truth. The foundation, he says, is unstable because it is built directly over a vast subterranean hidden pool. Vortigern, stunned, orders his men to dig. And it is just as the boy said. They dig, and the mud and stone give way to a dark, underground lake. But the reveal is not over. Now, Merlin commands the trembling magicians, "Tell me what is in that pool." They are silent, terrified. Merlin announces that at the bottom of the pool lie two great, hollow stones, and inside those stones sleep two dragons. The workmen drain the pool, find the stones, and crack them open. And from them, in a hiss of steam and ancient fury, emerge two colossal dragons. One, a brilliant, terrifying red. The other, a ghostly, ominous white. They immediately begin to fight. The court watches in horror as the white dragon seems to win, driving the red dragon to the edge of the lake. But then, the red dragon recovers its strength, turns, and unleashes a final fiery assault, devouring its white rival. The battle is over. Vortigern, utterly shaken, turns to the small, demonic-looking boy and asks what this means. This is the moment Geoffrey creates Merlin the prophet. The boy launches into a long, cryptic, and visionary speech, a section of the book so famous it was circulated separately as the Prophetia Merlini, the prophecies of Merlin. The white dragon, he explains, is the Saxons. The red dragon is the people of Britain. The Saxons, Merlin says, will overrun the island and oppress the Britons. The red dragon will be weak. But then, he prophesies, the boar of Cornwall shall come to the rescue. He shall trample their necks under his feet. This boar of Cornwall, of course, is Arthur. Merlin then continues, his prophecies becoming wilder and more psychedelic, a coded, allegorical future for the entire island of Britain. This scene is the mainstream fact of Merlin's literary origin, but it presents a profound historiographic mystery. Where did Geoffrey get this? He claimed his ancient book, of course, but as we've seen, that's likely a fiction. The truth is more complex and far more interesting. Geoffrey, a brilliant synthesizer, appears to have found this story in Nennius. Remember Nennius, our 9th century scrapbooker? In his book, the Historia Britonum, this exact story appears. But the boy has a different name. In Nennius's telling, the boy is named Ambrosius. He is, in fact, the same Ambrosius Aurelianus that Gildas had named as the last of the Romans. Nennius had turned the historical general into a magical child prophet. Geoffrey, it seems, wanted to use Ambrosius as a historical king, the one who would fight before Arthur's father, so he couldn't also have him be a magical boy. He needed a new name for his prophet, and he found one in the popular circulating Welsh folklore of his own day, the legend of Myrddin Wyllt, or Myrddin the Wild. This Myrddin was a completely different figure from Geoffrey's new character. The Welsh legends, which Geoffrey would later write about in his Vita Merlini, Life of Merlin, told of a 6th century warrior and bard, a contemporary of the real Dark Ages. This Myrddin fought in a terrible, brutal battle between rival British kings, the Battle of Afterid, around 523 AD. In the midst of the slaughter, watching his king and kinsmen cut down, Myrddin is driven hopelessly, profoundly insane. He flees the world of men and runs to the ancient forest of Celidon, that same Forest of Celadon from Nennius's battle list. There he lives as a beast, growing hair, eating roots, and sleeping in trees, accompanied only by a piglet. In his madness, this wild man of the woods is given the gift of prophecy. He becomes a shamanistic, tragic figure, lamenting his lost honor and crying out cryptic, sorrowful prophecies about the fate of the Welsh people. This was Geoffrey's masterstroke. He took the name and prophetic reputation of the popular tragic Myrddin Wyllt, and he grafted it onto the unnamed boy in Nennius's story about Vortigern's tower. He effectively stole the boy prophet story from Ambrosius and gave it to Myrddin. He even tweaked the name. In Norman French, Myrddin sounded dangerously close to Myrde, the word for, well, you can guess. So Geoffrey Latinized it to the more dignified Merlinus, and thus Merlin was born. But Geoffrey's Merlin wasn't just a prophet. He became the political puppet master of the entire saga. He is the one who enables Arthur's very conception through magic. He is the one who, according to Geoffrey, built Stonehenge by magically transporting the stones from Ireland. He is the one who advises Uther and then Arthur on matters of state and war. He is no longer the mad, tragic poet of the woods. He is a new archetype, the eminent screes, the wizard behind the throne, the kingmaker, the druidic architect of a whole new British destiny, all seen in the vision of a red dragon triumphant. Geoffrey of Monmouth's new grand vision of history had been unleashed, And his prophet, Merlin, had set the stage. He had revealed the vision of the Red Dragon, the boar of Cornwall, who would unite the island and forge an empire. But now that boar had to be delivered. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's ascension, however, is surprisingly political. In his Historia, when King Uther Pendragon finally dies from a poisoned spring, a rather unceremonious end for a great king, the realm is thrown into chaos. The barons are squabbling, the Saxons are pressing at the borders, and there is no clear heir. At this moment, Merlin, the great puppet master, steps out of the shadows. He approaches the Archbishop of Canterbury and reveals the great secret that Uther had a son, a boy named Arthur, who had been raised in secret. Convinced by the wizard and the urgency of the situation, the nobles agree to meet this 15-year-old boy. He is brought forth, presented with the royal regalia, and crowned. It is a coronation, a political solution, an accession to the throne that happens through revelation and acceptance. And for many, this was not enough. This is the great historical mystery of the next phase of the legend. Geoffrey's story, while epic, left a gaping hole in its logic, especially for a 12th century audience obsessed with primogeniture and clear lines of succession. Arthur's claim was, to be blunt, incredibly weak. He was an unknown, a secret, and as we shall see, an illegitimate child. He wasn't the rightful heir. He was a magical wild card pushed onto the throne by a wizard. In a world of brutal feudal politics, this was a recipe for civil war. The legend needed a better story. It needed something more than a wizard's word. It needed a miracle. Into this narrative gap stepped a French poet named Robert de Boron. Writing in the late 12th century, Robert was deeply interested in the Christian and mystical underpinnings of the Arthurian world. He looked at Geoffrey's political coronation and saw a missed opportunity for a divine stamp of approval. And so, he invented a scene so powerful, so iconic, that it has almost completely erased Geoffrey's original version from the popular imagination. He invented the sword in the stone. Robert's version is pure, calculated theological theatre. He sets the scene in London, not at a political council, but at a moment of profound spiritual crisis. King Uther is dead. The land is lawless. The barons are on the verge of tearing the kingdom apart. Merlin, ever the stage manager, instructs the Archbishop of Canterbury to summon every noble in the land to London on Christmas morning. They are to come to the greatest church and pray, and God, Merlin promises, will show them a sign. He will reveal the one true king. Imagine that morning. The frosty, biting air of a medieval London winter. The vast, cold interior of the stone cathedral, thick with the smell of incense and beeswax candles. The nobles of the realm, wrapped in furs, their breath pluming in the air, are packed inside, praying with a genuine, desperate fervor. They are men who live by the sword, and they are now, in their failure, begging for a divine solution. As the Mass reaches its climax, a murmur starts at the back of the church. Those near the doors look out into the churchyard, their eyes wide with disbelief. A miracle. There, in the frozen mud of the yard, where no such thing had been the night before, was a great 4-square block of stone. Some said it was marble, others a steel anvil. And plunged deep into its center was a magnificent, noble sword, its hilt gleaming in the weak winter light. The Archbishop, followed by the stunned congregation, moves to the stone. There, etched in the metal or the stone itself, are letters of gold, and they read, "Whoso pulleth out this sword from this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England." This was it. Not a debate, not a political compromise, a test set by God Himself. The mainstream fact of this part of the legend is its sheer undeniable brilliance as a piece of propaganda. It reframes the entire concept of kingship. The rightful king is not the man with the biggest army, or the most powerful father, or the best political connections. The rightful king is the one God chooses. And God, it seems, has a flair for the dramatic. What follows is a scene of profound public failure. The strongest dukes, the most arrogant earls, the most famous knights, they all have a go. You can almost hear the grunts, the scraping of steel on stone, the clatter of armor as they put their shoulders into it, their faces turning red with effort. They are the strongest men in the kingdom, the 1%ers of feudal power, and they all fail. The sword does not budge. It is a public, humiliating demonstration that might does not make right. The test, it seems, is not one of strength at all. The kingdom is left, once again, without a king. But Robert de Boron introduces a new set of characters, the narrative lens through which we see the miracle. He gives us the kindly, loyal Sir Ector, his boorish, arrogant son, Sir Kay, and Kay's young, unassuming squire, a boy named Arthur. They are in London, not for the king test, but for a great New Year's tournament. Sir Kay, preparing for the jousts, suddenly realizes he has left his sword back at their lodgings. He turns to his young squire, and in that casually demanding way of an older brother, orders Arthur to ride back and fetch it. Arthur, ever dutiful, races off. But when he gets to the lodging, the doors are locked. Everyone is at the tournament. In a moment of youthful panic, he worries he has failed his brother. And then, riding back through the empty city, he passes the churchyard. He sees the stone. He sees the sword. He doesn't, in this first innocent moment, read the inscription. He has no idea what he is looking at. He just thinks, "Oh, here's a sword. I'll just borrow this one. Kay will never know." He hops off his horse, runs over, and puts his hand on the hilt. He gives it a simple, artless pull, and the blade slides free from the stone with no resistance at all, as if it were sliding from a scabbard of silk. This is the hypothesis at the heart of the story's power. The sword is a test of innocence, not strength. Arthur is the only one who can pull it, not because he is a great warrior, he isn't yet, but because he is the only one who doesn't want the power it represents. He is not pulling it to become king. He is pulling it to help his brother. It is a perfect symbol of divine right, a legitimacy conferred by God that bypasses the entire, corrupt, human power structure. It is a story that says true authority comes from character and destiny, not from ambition. When Arthur brings the sword to Sir Kay, the older brother instantly recognizes it, and for a moment tries to claim he did it himself. But Ector, his father, is wiser. He makes them ride back to the churchyard, where the miracle is confirmed. The great lords, summoned from the tournament, are in disbelief. This boy, this no-name squire, they refuse to accept it, forcing Arthur to repeat the miracle again and again. But the result is always the same. The sword yields only to him. This story, Robert de Boron's brilliant addition, solved Geoffrey's legitimacy problem forever. Arthur's right to rule was now absolute, signed and delivered by God. But this divine miracle, this public sign, was itself a cover. It was the official story that papered over a much darker, stranger, and more morally complex origin. A secret that Merlin and only a few others knew. The deeply problematic, magical, and tragic story of Arthur's conception, that public miracle of the sword in the stone, the one Robert de Boron gave us, was, in its own way, a necessary and brilliant piece of theatre. It was the official story, the divine sign that proved Arthur's right to rule, a public demonstration of God's favor. But it was a sign designed to mask a much older, darker, and more profoundly uncomfortable secret, a truth so politically dangerous it could have shattered the kingdom before Arthur ever had a chance to build it. This was the secret of his conception, a story not of divine will, but of human lust, black magic, and tragic, brutal timing. To find this story, we must travel back 9 months before the sword ever appeared in the stone, to the troubled reign of Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon. Geoffrey of Monmouth, our great inventor, is the one who gives us this tale. Uther, he tells us, was a strong king, a warrior, the brother of that magical boy prophet, Ambrosius, and now the protector of the realm. But he was also a man ruled by his passions. He held a great feast, perhaps at Christmas, a time meant for peace, unity, and the celebration of God's grace. He summoned all his vassals, his dukes and earls, to his court in London. Among them was Gorlois, the formidable Duke of Cornwall, and with him he brought his wife, the Duchess Igraine. Geoffrey tells us she was the most beautiful woman in Britain, a woman of unrivaled grace and nobility, and when Uther's gaze fell upon her, the king, the judge, the protector of his people, was consumed by a sudden, violent, and uncontrollable obsession. He could not eat. He could not speak to anyone else. He sent her gifts. He toasted her publicly. He stared at her, ignoring all matters of state, until the entire court was whispering in uncomfortable silence. This is the first crucial element of the story. Igraine was not a willing participant. She was, as the texts emphasize, a good and faithful wife, noble and wise. She felt the king's predatory gaze, recognized the danger in it, and was, quite frankly, terrified. This was not a harmless flirtation. This was the obsessive desire of an absolute monarch, a man who had the power to take whatever he wanted. That night, she told her husband, Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall, was a proud and famously short-tempered man. Hearing his wife's fear and seeing the insult to his own honor, he reacted not as a politician, but as a husband. He did the unthinkable. Without asking the king's permission, without a formal, by your leave, he packed up his household and his wife, and in the dead of night, he fled the court. In the rigid, feudal world of the 12th century, this was not just rude. It was an act of open, defiant rebellion. Uther, his pride wounded and his lust thwarted, was incandescent with rage. He sent messengers, commanding Gorlois to return. Gorlois refused, and so Uther declared him a traitor and raised the royal army. The war that followed was not about land or taxes or justice. It was about one man's pathological need to possess another man's wife. Gorlois knew he could not defeat the king's army in an open field. He raced back to his lands in Cornwall and adopted a desperate defensive strategy. He had two main strongholds. The first was the castle of Demilioch, a well-fortified but otherwise unremarkable fortress. The second was the one that would become immortal, Tintagel. It's hard to overstate the dramatic, impossible nature of Tintagel. It is not so much a castle as a shard of rock, a jagged headland thrust out into the furious North Atlantic, connected to the mainland by a bridge so narrow and wind-blasted it seems like a thread. It was, in medieval times, considered utterly impregnable. Golwa, in a fateful decision, split his forces. He secreted himself in the more vulnerable castle, Demiliok, believing Uther would come for him, the traitor. But he sent Igraine, the true object of the war, to Tintagel, the place he thought no army could ever reach. He miscalculated. Uther's army surrounded both castles, but the king's focus, his entire being, was fixed on the cliffs of Tintagel. He paced his tent, sick with love, falling into a deep, agonizing depression. He was a king who could not get what he wanted. His siege was failing, and in this moment of total despair, he summoned his only hope, Merlin. Uther confessed his sickness, his love for Igraine. Merlin, the prophet, the man who sees all angles, listened patiently. He is not portrayed as a moralist. He is a pragmatist. He sees the king destroying the kingdom for a personal whim, and he sees an opportunity. He sees a way to channel this destructive, selfish energy into something else. He makes the bargain, the most famous in the legend. "I can get you this woman," Merlin says. "I can make it so you walk into Tintagel, and she will think you are her husband. But you must swear an oath on your soul. The child that is begotten of this union, you will deliver to me to raise as I see fit, for I have purpose for this child." Uther, half mad, agreed instantly. That night, Merlin performed his greatest and most terrible illusion. He used his arts to change Uther Pendragon. He didn't just give him a disguise. He resculpted his face, his voice, his walk. He became a perfect, living duplicate of Duke Golwa. Merlin, in turn, disguised himself and a companion, Sir Ulfius, as Golwa's personal retainers. The three of them rode through the lashing wind and salt spray to Tintagel's gate. The guards on the rampart, peering down into the dark, saw their duke, miraculously returned from the siege. They snapped to attention and lowered the drawbridge. Uther, wearing another man's face, walked into the fortress, and Igraine, in the high tower, hearing the horns, was overcome with joy and relief, believing her husband had slipped through the enemy lines. That night, Uther lay with Igraine, and in that act of profound magical deception, Arthur, the future king, was conceived. And here, the legend delivers its most brutal, tragic twist. The mainstream fact of the story, as told by Geoffrey and later Mallory, is one of perfect, terrible timing. At the very hour that Uther was in Tintagel, disguised as Golwa, the real Golwa, back at Demiliok, decided to lead a desperate, hopeless charge against the king's besieging forces. He was cut down, killed in the mud and rain, not even knowing his wife was being betrayed. This dark, morally grey, and deeply uncomfortable story is the legend's true origin. This presents our historiographic mystery. Why this? Why not a miraculous virgin birth? Why not a noble, legitimate heir? Why a birth founded on rape by deception, on murder, and on a broken oath? The most powerful hypothesis is that this story is a necessary, sophisticated piece of theological and political damage control. The legend needed Arthur to be special, to be more than just another king. He had to be a child of magic, a child of destiny. By having Merlin orchestrate the entire event, the storytellers cleverly lift the sin from Arthur himself. Arthur is not the product of Uther's lust. He is the product of Merlin's plan. Merlin is the agent of fate, using the king's sin to bring about the kingdom's salvation. The magic launders the sin. It makes Arthur a being of both worlds, born of a king's line, but delivered by magic, a man destined, from his very first moment, to be separate, special, and ultimately alone. Arthur was now a king, but he was a king born of a secret. His public claim came from that miraculous, divinely sanctioned sword in the stone, a story of pure, simple faith. His true origin, which we now know, was a story of magic, deception, and the tragic death of Gaulois on the battlements of Demilioc. This duality defined him. He was a king with one foot in the world of men and the other in Merlin's world of prophecy and fate. And as this boy king, barely a man, took the throne, he faced an immediate, intensely practical problem. He had united the kingdom, but he had done so by binding together a collection of the most powerful, arrogant, and violently proud men on the island. These were the barons, the dukes, the earls. These were men who had, for a generation, been their own kings. They had bowed to him, yes, but their loyalty was brittle, based on a miracle they couldn't explain, and a battlefield prowess they were only just beginning to see. Now, imagine the first great feast of the new reign. The hall is built, the fires are lit. The king must sit down to eat with his new vassals. In any normal medieval court, this moment is a political nightmare. The entire structure of feudalism is based on a rigid, brutal hierarchy. The central feature is the high table, a raised dais where the king and his most favored subjects sit, looking down on everyone else. Who gets to sit at this table? Who sits closest to the king's right hand? Who sits below the salt, in the lower, draftier end of the hall? To give one baron precedence over another was to publicly declare his importance, and in doing so, to publicly insult the other. To sit a man like the Duke of Cornwall next to the King of Orkney might, in itself, be cause for a duel or a private war. For a new young king like Arthur, whose power was still consolidating, this was not a matter of etiquette. It was a matter of survival. One poorly planned dinner party could shatter his new kingdom. This is the political and human problem that gave birth to the single most powerful symbol of his entire reign. The legend, in its wisdom, provides a solution that is so simple, so elegant. It feels revolutionary even today. Arthur, or perhaps Merlin advising him, does not create a high table. He creates the round table. This is not an invention of Geoffrey of Monmouth's. His Arthur had a splendid court, full of luxury, but no specific symbolic piece of furniture. The table, as a distinct object, makes its first appearance in the year 1155, in a work called The Roman de Brute. It was written by a poet named Wace, who was translating Geoffrey's Historia into French for the new Anglo-Norman aristocracy. Wace, a wonderful storyteller, simply added it. He paused his translation to note that he'd heard tell that Arthur had a round table, of which the Britons tell many a fable, and that he had it made to avoid quarrels of precedence. None was higher than the other. All were seated as equals, and all were served in the same way. This is the mainstream fact of its literary birth. It was a solution to a political problem. And with that one addition, Wace changed the entire character of Arthur's court. A circle has no head. It has no foot. There is no seat of honor. The king himself does not sit above his knights, he sits among them. This was a radical, revolutionary idea. It instantly transformed the feudal structure. Arthur's knights were not just his vassals, his underlings. They were his fellowship. They were a brotherhood. This table, this massive disk of wood, became the physical embodiment of a new kind of chivalry, an oath of equality. It meant that the newest, youngest knight, if he proved his worth, had a voice as clear as the oldest, most powerful duke. It was the symbol of a new order, a new idea of justice. But as with all things in this legend, what began as a simple, practical invention was quickly given a much deeper, more mystical origin. The poet Robert de Boron, the same man who, remember, gave us the divine miracle of the sword in the stone, was not satisfied with the table being a simple solution to squabbling. He, too, saw an opportunity. He wove the table into his grand, mystical Christian backstory. In his telling, the round table was not Arthur's invention at all. It was created by Merlin. And Merlin created it for Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, as part of his great divine plan. More than that, Merlin's table was a copy of another table, the table of the Holy Grail, which had been established by Joseph of Arimathea when he first brought the sacred cup to Britain. And that table was in turn an imitation of the table used by Christ at the Last Supper. The round table was now the third in a holy trinity of tables. It was a sacred object, a symbol of the divine plan for Britain. Merlin, in this telling, instructs Uther to build it, and it has seats for 50 knights. But one seat, Merlin warns, must always be left empty. This seat, he says, is the Siege Perilous, the perilous seat. It is reserved for the one perfect, holy knight who is destined to appear in the fullness of time and who will achieve the quest for the Holy Grail. Any other man, any flawed or sinful knight who dares to sit in it will be instantly devoured, swallowed by fire and earth. This, of course, creates a terrible, tantalizing, and visible reminder of the court's own imperfection, a challenge built right into their central symbol. So now we have these two ideas, the political and the mystical, flowing together. The table is a symbol of perfect human equality, and at the same time, a symbol of a divine hierarchical quest for spiritual perfection. And this brings us to our great historiographic mystery, the object itself. Did it exist? The answer, incredibly, is yes, sort of. If you travel today to the Great Hall of Winchester Castle, the last remaining piece of a fortress begun by William the Conqueror, you will see it. Hanging on the stone wall is a colossal, staggering object, a wooden disc, 18 feet across, weighing over a ton, painted in alternating wedges of white and green, with the names of Arthur's knights written around the rim. It is, without question, a medieval round table, but it is not Arthur's table. This is the hypothesis, now confirmed by science. This table is a real historical object, a mainstream fact. But dendrochronology, tree ring dating, has proven that the timbers used to build it were felled between 1250 and 1280. This is 700 years after the historical Arthur was supposed to have lived. It was almost certainly built by King Edward I, a king who was utterly, almost fanatically, obsessed with the Arthurian legend. He saw himself as the new Arthur, and he likely had this table built for a round table tournament, a grand chivalric festival, a kind of medieval cosplay, where his own knights would dress up and joust in imitation of their storybook heroes. The painting we see on it is even later. added by King Henry VIII in the 1500s, who, in his own act of propaganda, had the central portrait of Arthur painted with his face and the Tudor rose placed at the center. This object, the Winchester table, is perhaps the perfect summary of the entire legend. It is not real in the way we want it to be, but it is a very real, very expensive, and very heavy proof of how powerful the idea of Arthur had become. The story had become so potent that real kings were spending real fortunes to build props from it, to physically insert themselves into its narrative. The symbol had become more real than the man, and it was at this table, in the shining, idealized capital, that the fellowship would gather, ready to receive their quests. That round table, whether it was King Edward's real-life prop or the mystical table of Robert de Boron's imagination, needed a home. A fellowship so revolutionary, a symbol of equality so profound, could not simply meet in any drafty, borrowed hall. It required a capital, a city that was itself a symbol. It needed a fortress that was not just a place of defense, but a beacon, the shining physical heart of the new civilized world Arthur was trying to build. In the legend, this city has a name that rings with an almost magical resonance: Camelot. Camelot, in our shared imagination, is the perfect castle. It is the shining city on a hill, its white towers scraping the clouds, its banners of the red dragon snapping in a clean, bright wind. It is a place of order, music, and light, a pinprick of perfect geometry in the midst of a dark, chaotic, and waste land. It is the place where the round table sits in the great hall, where knights receive their quests from weeping damsels, and where they return battered and victorious to lay their trophies at the feet of the king and queen. It is the central, unmoving point of the entire Arthurian universe, the anchor of the world, the dream of civilization made manifest in stone. This vision is the mainstream fact of the legend. And yet, here is the first sharp shock of historical reality. It is a total invention, and a surprisingly late one. If you go back to our great inventor, Geoffrey of Monmouth, you will not find the word Camelot anywhere in his Historia. Geoffrey, who was, remember, trying to create a realistic history, placed Arthur's capital at a real historical location, Caerleon on Usk, in Wales. This was the Castra Legionum, the city of the Legion, a massive, genuine Roman fortress, and a place that a post-Roman, Roman-identifying king would have logically used as his base. The name Camelot appears for the first time, almost as a throwaway line, in a French poem from the 1170s. The poet is Chrétien de Troyes, a man we will soon come to know very well, and in his story of Lancelot, he simply mentions that Arthur is holding court at a place called Camelot. He doesn't describe it. He doesn't say where it is. He just names it. It was, perhaps, a name he'd heard in a circulating folktale, or a name he simply invented because it had a good, strong Celtic sound to it. But the name stuck, and it grew. Later writers, especially the French, took this vague name and began to build upon it, projecting all their ideals of a perfect, chivalric, Gothic city onto this blank canvas. Camelot became the dream capital, a place outside of time and geography. And this, of course, has led to the great, centuries-long historiographic mystery. If Camelot was real, where was it? This question, like who was Arthur, has become a magnificent obsession. The candidates are many. There is Geoffrey's pick, Caerleon, with its real Roman amphitheater, which, in the medieval imagination, was easily mistaken for the Round Table itself. There is Winchester, the favored choice of Sir Thomas Malory, mostly because, by his time in the 15th century, that massive, impressive prop table was already hanging on the wall, a piece of irrefutable, if anachronistic, evidence. But the strongest, most tantalizing candidate for a historical Camelot, for the real fortress of a real 5th century warlord, is a place called Cadbury Castle. It is a massive, ancient Iron Age hill fort in Somerset, a place that has been fortified for thousands of years. It looms over the surrounding landscape, a natural stronghold, and archaeological excavations in the 1960s revealed something electrifying. They proved that this ancient fort was massively refortified on a colossal scale at exactly the right time, the late 5th century, the age of Arthur. The crude ancient ramparts were rebuilt and strengthened with stone and timber in a style that was not Roman, but not Saxon either. It was distinctly British. And at the very summit, the highest point of the fort, they found the post holes for a massive, timber-framed great hall, far larger than any other building from that period. Here we must contrast the myth with this bleak, muddy, and magnificent reality. The myth of Camelot is a soaring 13th century Gothic cathedral of a castle, with pointed arches, stone vaults, and glass windows. The reality of this 5th century Camelot at Cadbury would have been terrifying, impressive, but deeply uncomfortable. It would have been a ring of 20-foot-high earthen banks, topped with a wooden palisade, slick with rain and mud. The Great Hall would have been a long, dark timber building, its roof thatched with reeds, the inside cavernous and filled with smoke from a central fire pit. The floor would be packed earth, strewn with rushes to soak up the spilled ale and the bones tossed to the dogs. It would have smelled of wood smoke, wet wool, horses, and 100 unwashed warriors. This was the court of a dux bellorum. This was the fortress of the man Nennius described, the man who fought 12 battles. It was not a place of polite chivalry. It was a barracks, a mead hall, a last-ditch defense against the end of the world. And yet, it is the most potent, real place we have. And it even sits close to the villages of Queen Camel and West Camel, a faint, lingering echo of the name that Chrétien would one day make immortal. The ultimate hypothesis is that Camelot is not a physical place on a map. It is a utopia, which in the Greek literally means no place. It is the name we give to the idea of Arthur's court, the dream of a perfect, just, and civilized society. It is a floating symbol, a New Jerusalem, that the legend needed. It was the theater, the grand stage where the Round Table could sit. And now that this stage was built, with its shining imaginary walls, it was time for the actors, the knights themselves, to take their seats. But the knights who would come to define the legend, the ones whose names we remember, Lancelot, Galahad, Percival, were not, as you might expect, from Britain at all. They were waiting across the Channel in the courts of France. We have our stage, the shining imaginary walls of Camelot, that no place of perfect order, are now built, and in its great hall we have our central prop, the Round Table, a massive physical symbol of a new equal fellowship. We have our king, Arthur, and our prophet, Merlin. But a stage, a prop, and a king are not a story. They are a situation. If you go back to Geoffrey of Monmouth's Grand Historia, the book that invented Arthur as an emperor, you'll find that the knights of his court, well, They don't really do very much. They are an army. They wait for Arthur to declare a war, and then they fight it. They are a supporting cast, a collective noun. The Historia is an epic, but it lacks personal drama. It tells us how an empire was won, but not what it felt like to live in it. This is where the legend takes its most profound and most human turn. The story of Arthur, the political epic, was finished by Geoffrey, but the stories of his knights had not even begun. And for this, the legend had to cross the English Channel. It had to leave the world of grim, Latin-speaking historians and enter the perfumed, colorful, and psychologically complex world of the 12th century French court. This new world was dominated by powerful, educated, and frankly, probably very bored noblewomen. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter, Marie de Champagne. These were women who were themselves trapped in political marriages. They were connoisseurs of art, poetry, and music, and they were not interested in reading another dry pseudo-history about who conquered Gaul. They wanted something new. They wanted stories about feelings. They wanted passion, drama, and personal sacrifice. They wanted, in short, romance, and the man who gave it to them was a poet named Chrétien de Troyes. Writing around the 1170s and 1180s, under the patronage of Marie de Champagne herself, Chrétien is arguably the single most important figure in the legend after Geoffrey. He is the man who looked at Arthur's court and, in a stroke of genius, invented three things that would come to define it forever: the individual quest, the code of chivalry, and the agonizing, beautiful poison of courtly love. Let's start with the quest. Chrétien was the first to realize that the most interesting stories happen away from the court. He instinctively understood that Camelot was not the subject of the story. It was the starting point. Arthur, in Chrétien's hands, fades into the background. He becomes a static, almost symbolic king, the man who presides over the round table, the quest giver. The real heroes are the individual knights. Chrétien, in his poems like Eric and Anida and Yvonne, the Knight of the Lion, invents the chevalier errant, the wandering knight. This is the knight who, motivated by a personal grievance, a plea from a mysterious damsel, or just a profound sense of ennui, rides out from Camelot alone. He rides into the magical, enchanted forest of Brocéliande, a landscape where the rules of reality are suspended, where he will be tested. This is a massive shift. The goal is no longer to save the kingdom. The goal is to prove one's own worth. It is a journey of self-discovery. But how is that worth measured? This is Chrétien's second invention, chivalry. Geoffrey's warriors were brave and loyal, but they were also brutal. Chrétien gives them a new, idealized operating system. Chivalry was a code, a fantasy of the perfect knight. He must be pious, yes. He must be brave, of course. But now, he must also be courteous. He must protect the weak, be merciful to a defeated foe, a revolutionary idea in a world where ransoming was the norm. And above all, he must serve and honor all women. This code, chivalry, was a literary invention, a way to tame the savage, hyper-violent warrior class of the 12th century and repackage them as heroes, as something more than just well-armed thugs. And this brings us to his third and most world-changing invention, fin amour, or courtly love. This is the engine that drives all of Chrétien's quests. His knights are not just fighting for God or for Arthur. They are fighting for the love of a lady. And this, to our modern minds, is where things get strange. This courtly love was almost never love for one's own wife. In the 12th century, marriage among the nobility was a property merger, a business deal. Love was something that happened outside of it. Courtly love, as idealized by Chrétien and his patrons, was a secret, often adulterous, and deeply spiritualized passion. The knight would worship a noble lady, often his lord's wife, from afar. He would wear her token in a tournament. He would perform impossible deeds of valor, not to win her. That was often impossible and, in a way, undesirable, but simply to be worthy of her. She was his inspiration, his pole star, the source of all his virtue. This is the mainstream fact of the French romance, but it presents a fascinating historiographic mystery. Why this sudden, explosive obsession with adulterous love? Why would a society so publicly and rigidly pious create as its highest ideal a love that was, by definition, a mortal sin? The most compelling hypothesis is that it was a safe, literary fantasy, a kind of escape valve for the aristocratic women who were its primary audience. Women like Marie de Champagne, trapped in a political marriage, could not control their own lives. But in these stories, they could be the center of the universe. They became the judges, the patrons, the figures whose one approving glance could make a knight the greatest in the world. It was a fantasy that gave them power. Chrétien de Troyes wrote 5 great Arthurian poems. He gave us the definitive stories of Sir Ivan and Sir Percival. He gave us, as we saw, the first ever mention of the name Camelot. But his most famous, his most dangerous, and significantly, his unfinished poem was one he claimed his patron Marie personally commissioned. It was called Le Chevalier de la Charrette, the Knight of the Cart, and it told the story of the one knight who embodied this new, impossible code perfectly. The knight who was the greatest warrior in the world, and the knight who was hopelessly, tragically, and adulterously in love with Arthur's own queen, Guinevere. In this poem, Chrétien de Troyes introduced the world to the man who would, single-handedly, bring down the entire fellowship, Sir Lancelot. Before Chrétien de Troyes, the court of Arthur was a world of men. It was a military brotherhood, defined by loyalty to the king and the defense of the realm. But as we saw, Chrétien and his powerful female patrons introduced a new, explosive, and intoxicating idea: courtly love. They needed a hero who could embody this new, complex, and dangerous code. They needed a knight who was not just a warrior, but a lover. And so, in the 1170s, from the imagination of Chrétien de Troyes, a man steps onto the stage who is not mentioned once in Geoffrey of Monmouth, not once in Nennius, not once in the ancient Welsh tales. He is a total French invention, a literary creation inserted into the heart of the British legend, and he would come to dominate it forever. His name was Lancelot of the Lake. His introduction in the poem Le Chevalier de la Charrette, the Knight of the Cart, is one of the most radical and defining moments in Western literature. The story begins not with Lancelot, but with a crisis. A mysterious evil knight named Meleagant, the son of a rival king, storms into Arthur's court. He boasts that he holds many of Arthur's subjects captive in his land of no return, and as a final insult, he seizes Queen Guinevere and abducts her. The entire court is paralyzed, shamed, and helpless. Sir Gawain, Arthur's loyal nephew, immediately sets off in pursuit. But so does an unnamed mysterious knight. This, we learn, is Lancelot, Lancelot's pursuit is a masterpiece of psychological drama, a perfect illustration of the new conflicting rules of chivalry. He rides his horse to death, literally, in his desperate haste. On foot, he comes to a crossroads and meets a dwarf driving a simple two-wheeled cart. We must understand, in the 12th century, a cart was not just a mode of transport. It was a tumbril. It was the vehicle used to carry condemned criminals, thieves, murderers, traitors, to their public execution at the gallows. To be seen riding in this cart was to suffer a fate worse than death. It was an act of total, irreversible, and public shame. It was the complete and utter destruction of one's reputation. The dwarf looks at the desperate, unhorsed knight and makes a cruel offer. "If you want, I will give you a ride in my cart." Lancelot is faced with an impossible choice. In his mind, two codes are at war. The code of chivalry, his public honor and reputation, screams that to get in that cart is to destroy everything he is. But the code of courtly love, his absolute secret devotion to Guinevere, screams that any sacrifice, any shame, is worth it if it helps him save his lady. For one brief, fatal moment, he hesitates. Chrétien tells us he deliberated for 2 steps before shame gave way to love, and he climbed aboard. This is the entire, brilliant paradox of Lancelot. He endures this ultimate public humiliation for Guinevere. He is paraded through towns, mocked, spat at, and jeered as a condemned man, all in service of his queen. And yet, when he finally reaches Guinevere, she is not grateful. She is furious. She turns her back on him, refusing to speak. Why? Because he hesitated. Because for those 2 steps, his pride, his own reputation, mattered more to him than his absolute, unquestioning, selfless devotion to her. This is the new world of the French romance. It is a world of impossible, nuanced, and frankly neurotic emotional tests. And Lancelot is its perfect, flawed hero. The mainstream fact of his character, from this point forward, is that he is the best knight in the world. In every physical contest, he is unbeatable. His skill with the sword and lance is a gift, almost divine. He is the model of perfect chivalry. He is generous to a fault, merciful to his enemies, brave beyond measure, and courteous to all. He is the walking, breathing embodiment of the Round Table's ideal. And yet, he is built around a single, tragic, fatal flaw. His perfection as a knight is fueled by and inseparable from his one great sin, his adulterous love for Guinevere, his best friend's wife and his king's queen. This love is the seed of the court's destruction. It is the secret hypocrisy at the heart of the perfect court. This brings us to the great historiographic mystery of his creation. Why? Why would Chrétien de Troyes, or his patron Marie de Champagne, invent a character who is simultaneously the best and the worst of knights? Why make the hero of the story the man who commits the one sin that will bring it all crashing down? One hypothesis, the one many scholars lean toward, is that Chrétien himself was deeply uncomfortable with this. He even says in his prologue that his patron, Marie, gave him the matière et son, the matter and the sense of the story, implying, "Don't blame me, she told me to write it." He was a cleric after all, and this was a celebration of adultery. In fact, Chrétien abandoned the poem, leaving it to another, lesser poet to finish. Perhaps he found the implications too dark. Another hypothesis is that this was the point. This was not a celebration, but a sophisticated, grown-up tragedy. It was a story designed to show what happens when two goods are in absolute conflict. Lancelot's loyalty to Arthur, his feudal duty, and his devotion to Guinevere, his courtly duty. The story is a warning, a theological exploration of how even the noblest court in the world, if it is built on a foundation of human, sinful passion, is doomed to fail. Lancelot is the crack in the mirror. His love makes him the greatest worldly knight, but as we shall see, it is the one thing that makes him spiritually unworthy. He is the perfect, beautiful, and poisonous seed, and now that he is planted in Camelot's soil, the tragedy is no longer a question of if, but when. The introduction of Lancelot, that perfect, flawed, and devastatingly French hero, changes the entire chemistry of Camelot. He is the catalyst, the foreign element dropped into the seemingly stable solution of Arthur's court. But a catalyst needs something to react with. Lancelot's all-consuming, world-ending love requires an object, and she is the most important, most complex, and most tragic woman in the entire legend. She is the queen. She is Guinevere. Before the French romances, Guinevere's role was surprisingly thin. In the old Welsh traditions, she exists, but she is a shadowy and sometimes problematic figure. There are strange, cryptic references in the Welsh triads to Arthur's three great queens, all named Gwenhwyfar, the Welsh form of her name, suggesting, perhaps, an ancient, half-remembered triple goddess. In Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia, she is, as we've seen, respectable, beautiful, and descended from a noble Roman family. She is a good political match. She is the dignified, Roman-style empress to his emperor. When Mordred commits his great treason, he seizes the crown and the queen, but Geoffrey treats this more as a political power grab, a symbol of his usurpation, than a personal, passionate betrayal. He even notes that Guinevere, horrified, flees Mordred's advances and becomes a nun at Caerleon. It was the French poets, Chrétien de Troyes and his successors, who looked at this respectable, rather flat character and saw an opportunity. They needed a star for their new drama of courtly love. They needed the lady for whom the perfect knight would sacrifice his honor. And so, they plucked Guinevere from the background and thrust her into the very center of the story, right between her husband, the king, and his new champion, the knight. In doing so, they placed her in the most impossible position imaginable. This is Guinevere's great tragedy, the impossible choice that defines her. She is not just a person. She is a symbol, trapped between two conflicting, irreconcilable ideas of good. On one side, there is Arthur. He is her husband, her king, her duty. He is the man who represents order, stability, the realm, and the public good. In the romances, their marriage is almost always portrayed as respectable, dutiful, but emotionally distant. It is a political union, the foundation upon which the entire kingdom is built. To betray Arthur is not just to betray a husband, it is to betray the kingdom. It is to commit an act of treason that strikes at the very heart of the Round Table. Arthur is the ideal of Camelot, and on the other side, there is Lancelot. He is the best knight in the world. He is her champion, her devotee, her passion. He represents everything the new code of courtly love demands. He is the man who sees her, not the queen. He is the man who would, as we saw, ride in the cart of shame, sacrificing his public honor for his private devotion. He is thrilling, dangerous, and utterly devoted. This is the new, intoxicating good of the French romance, the idea that personal, passionate love is the highest virtue a knight and lady can aspire to. Lancelot is the reality of human desire. Guinevere is the woman caught in the middle of this. She must choose, every single day, between her public duty and her private heart. And the legend, in its wisdom, makes her choice a foregone conclusion. She chooses Lancelot. Or more accurately, she and Lancelot are drawn together by a force as powerful and impersonal as fate. Their love is not portrayed as a casual fling. It is a grand, consuming, and ultimately doomed passion. A love that is as much a part of the legend's divine plan as the sword, the stone. This is the mainstream fact of the high medieval legend. Guinevere and Lancelot's adultery is the original sin of Camelot. It is the secret, festering wound, the hypocrisy at the center of the perfect court. Everyone, it seems, knows about it, but no one dares to speak of it, because to speak it would be to make it real, and to make it real would be to bring the entire, shining edifice crashing to the ground. Arthur, in particular, is often portrayed as being in a state of willful denial, a king who must not see what is happening in front of him, because his entire world depends on his not seeing it. This brings us to the historiographic mystery of her character. Is she a villain, a victim, a tragic heroine? The medieval writers themselves seem unable to decide. In Chrétien's Knight of the Cart, she is a demanding, almost cruel mistress of courtly love, punishing Lancelot for a 2-second hesitation. In later works, like the massive 13th century Vulgate cycle, she is a much more human figure, passionate, yes, but also filled with guilt, fear, and a genuine, though less passionate, love for her husband Arthur. She is trapped by her own beauty and by the impossible demands of the two men who love her. The most fascinating hypothesis, however, circles back to those ancient pre-French whispers. The name Gwenhwyfar in Welsh can be translated as white shadow or white phantom, a name that already hints at an otherworldly, liminal nature. The recurring theme, even in the very earliest Welsh tales, is her abduction. She is constantly being kidnapped. Meleagant does it in the French romances. Mordred does it in Geoffrey's Historia. Even in the Welsh life of St. Gildas, a man named Melwas, king of the summer country, which sounds a lot like a pagan otherworld, abducts her, and Arthur must besiege his fortress for a year to get her back. Why is she always being stolen? One powerful theory suggests this is a faded myth. It suggests that Guinevere was never a woman at all, but was, in origin, a Celtic sovereignty goddess, a goddess of the land. In this ancient belief system, the king could only rule the land by marrying its goddess. To abduct the goddess, therefore, was to make a rival claim to the kingship. This would make her affair with Lancelot not just a story of human passion, but a deep mythological betrayal of the land itself. It is a sign that the king, Arthur, is losing his grip on his own kingdom, whether she is a human woman, a symbolic prize, or a fated goddess. Guinevere's choice introduces the poison. The court is now at its absolute zenith. It is powerful, famous, and civilized. But underneath the floorboards, in the secret chambers of the heart, this love triangle is rotting the foundations. The fellowship is bound by an oath of truth, but its two greatest members, the queen and the first knight, are living a profound lie. This spiritual sickness, this hypocrisy, creates a new kind of wasteland, not one of monsters and Saxons, but one of the soul. The court's worldly perfection is complete, but it has become spiritually hollow. And into this hollow, a new, desperate, and divine quest will have to be born. The court is now complete, but it is also, for the first time, profoundly sick. That love triangle, that great, tragic, and human passion between Lancelot and Guinevere, is a poison that has seeped into the foundations of Camelot. On the surface, everything is perfect. The banners are bright, the tournaments are glorious, the king is just, and the knights are the most famous in the world. But underneath, a spiritual ennui, a kind of hollowness, has set in. The secret sin of the best knight and the queen has created a hypocrisy, a crack in the very heart of the Round Table. The fellowship is bound by an oath of truth, but it is living a beautiful, magnificent lie. And like the old myths, this sickness of the king's court, this spiritual wound, begins to manifest in the land itself. The kingdom becomes a wasteland, a place where quests become pointless, where knights ride out only to fight each other, where the colors seem dimmer and the meaning is lost. The worldly perfection of Camelot has been achieved, and it has been found wanting. The court has become a mirror of Lancelot, perfect in all worldly things, but spiritually hollow. And into this vacuum, this desperate, unspoken need for meaning, a new kind of quest must be born. It cannot be another quest to kill a giant or a dragon. That is just worldly glory. It must be a quest for God. It must be a quest for the soul. The story, as it's told in the great 13th century French Vulgate cycle, reaches its crisis point, its moment of divine intervention, at the Feast of Pentecost, the celebration of the Holy Spirit. All the knights of the Round Table are gathered in the great hall of Camelot, as is their custom. They wait to begin the feast, but Arthur will not eat until, as he says, some great marvel appears, as it so often does. Suddenly, the very stones of the castle seem to groan. The doors and windows of the hall slam shut of their own accord. A silence falls, and then a soundless clap of thunder shakes the room. A single, perfect sunbeam, 7 times brighter than the day, lances through the darkness of the hall, illuminating the face of every knight. And riding upon that sunbeam, a vision, the Holy Grail. It floats into the hall, covered by a veil of white samite, so that no man may see the vessel itself. But as it passes, the entire hall is filled with the scent of every sweet herb, and every knight, as he looks at his plate, finds it piled high with the food his heart most desires. The vision is a moment of pure, unadulterated grace. It is God, made manifest, serving his supper to the knights of the Round Table. And then, as silently as it came, it is gone. A stunned silence. And in that silence, Sir Gawain, Arthur's nephew, loyal, brave, worldly, and ever impetuous, leaps to his feet. His face is streaked with tears. He makes a vow. He swears that he will ride out for a year and a day, and he will not rest. He will not return to court until he has seen the Grail unveiled. He has just made a terrible, prideful mistake. He has taken a moment of pure, divine gift and turned it into a quest, a trophy to be won, a thing to be achieved by strength and will. One by one, driven by Gawain's passion, the other knights of the Round Table stand and make the same vow. Sir Lancelot, his heart tearing in two, makes the vow, even as he feels the cold dread of his own unworthiness. King Arthur, watching, his heart broken, he weeps openly. He understands what his knights do not. This vow is not the beginning of a great adventure. It is the end of the round table. You have slain me, he whispers, for you are now departing from me, and I shall never see my fellowship whole again. This is the mainstream fact of the quest's beginning. It is a 13th century, profoundly Christian, and specifically Cistercian, a strict monastic order invention. The authors of these great prose romances looked at the world Chrétien de Troyes had built, a world of courtly love, passion, and adultery, and they saw a profound sickness. The Grail quest is their answer to that sickness. It is an attempt to cleanse the legend, to baptize it, to reject the worldly chivalry of Lancelot and replace it with a new spiritual chivalry. And what then is this Grail? According to these new monastic authors, it is the holiest relic in all of Christendom. It is the San Graal, the Holy Grail. The legend they constructed is precise. It is the cup, the very vessel that Jesus Christ used at the Last Seder, the Last Supper. It was then, the story goes, given to Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy disciple who took Christ's body down from the cross. As Joseph washed the body for burial, he used that same cup to catch the last drops of blood that fell from the wound in Christ's side. It is, therefore, a vessel that has held both the wine of the Eucharist and the literal blood of God. Joseph, according to the legend, brought this sacred, terrifyingly powerful object to Britain, to a hidden castle in the wasteland, where it is guarded by his descendants, a line of wounded kings known as the Fisher King. But this brings us to our great historiographic mystery. Where did this complex story come from? It seems to burst onto the scene, fully formed, in the late 12th and 13th centuries. Chrétien de Troyes himself wrote the first Grail story, Perceval, or the Story of the Grail, which he left unfinished. But in his poem, The Grail is a strange and wondrous object. But he never calls it holy. He describes it as a wide, deep platter, a gradalis, that holds a single communion wafer, and it is carried in a procession with a bleeding lance. It's mysterious, but it's not explicitly the cup of Christ. The most powerful hypothesis is that this Holy Grail is a perfect example of a faded myth. It is a piece of ancient, pre-Christian Celtic folklore, scrubbed clean and baptized by the later monastic writers. Remember that dark, strange Welsh poem, Breudo Anwen, where Arthur raided the otherworld to steal a magical cauldron. A cauldron that provided endless food and would not cook for a coward. This, many scholars believe, is the pagan original. The French romances, hearing these bardic tales of a magical food-providing vessel, simply mistook it, or more likely, reinterpreted it, as the Christian chalice. The wasteland and the wounded king also reek of pagan antiquity. This is a story far older than Christianity, the sympathetic magic that ties the fertility of the land directly to the physical and often sexual vitality of its king. The Fisher King is wounded in the thighs, a common medieval euphemism for the groin. Because the king is sterile, the land is sterile. This is a sovereignty myth, Christianized. The quest is not just to find a cup, it is to heal the king, and in so doing, heal the land. But this new Christianized quest has new, terrifying rules. It is not a test of arms, it is a test of the soul. A knight cannot fight his way to the Grail. His strength is useless. His worldly honor is a liability. The Grail demands one thing, and one thing only: spiritual purity. And this is the tragedy for Arthur's court. Lancelot, the best knight in the world, is, by this new standard, the worst. His entire being is defined by his adulterous love, his attachment to the world. He and the other knights ride out, and they fail. They are cast into a spiritual wilderness. Lancelot himself, after a year of struggle, comes close. He reaches the Grail Castle, Corbenic. He peeks into the sacred chamber, but as he tries to enter, a blast of fiery breath strikes him down, and he falls into a coma for 24 days. 1 day for every year he has lived in sin. He wakes a broken man, his perfection shattered. The old order has failed the new test. The world, it seems, needs a new kind of hero. The quest for the Holy Grail had shattered the old order. The Knights of the Round Table, the greatest fellowship of worldly heroes ever assembled, had been sent out on a quest where their worldly skills were, for the first time, utterly useless. Their strength, their loyalty, their courage, none of it mattered. The Grail demanded not a better warrior, but a better soul. And as we saw, Lancelot, the best knight in the world, was the quest's most spectacular failure. His entire life, his entire code of honor, was built upon the sin of his love for Guinevere. He was the perfect, flawed, human hero, and in the face of this divine test, his perfection was revealed as a spiritual void. The old world had failed. The quest and the legend needed a new kind of hero. This new hero, as envisioned by the 13th century monastic authors of the Questa del San Graal, the quest of the Holy Grail, had to be everything Lancelot was not. He had to be pure. He had to be a virgin. He had to be a knight of Christ, a warrior monk whose strength came not from his own will or his love for a queen, but from the grace of God. And so, in one of the most brilliant and calculated moves in literary history, they invented him, and they made him Lancelot's son. His name was Galahad. His origin story is a dark, strange, and tragic echo of Arthur's own conception, another tale of magical deception. The legend tells of a place, the Grail Castle of Corbenic, where the Fisher King, Pelles, guarded the holy relic. King Pelles had a daughter, Elaine of Corbenic, a different Elaine from the one who died for love of Lancelot. Pelles, through his mystic knowledge, knew a prophecy that the best knight in the world, Lancelot, would father a son, and that this son would be the one to achieve the Grail and heal the wasteland. But there was a problem. Lancelot was in love with Guinevere and would sleep with no other. So King Pelles, in a move of desperate divine pragmatism, conspires. He employs a sorceress, Dame Brusin, to aid him. She gives Elaine a magic ring, or perhaps a potion, that makes her appear, in all ways, to be Queen Guinevere. Like Uther before him, Lancelot is tricked. Lured to the castle, he believes Guinevere has secretly summoned him. He goes to Elaine's chamber, and in the darkness, believing her to be his one true love, he sleeps with her. In that single engineered night of sin, Galahad, the world's most perfect and pure knight, is conceived. This is the great, complex theology of the 13th century authors. Galahad is the son of Lancelot's sin, but he himself is utterly innocent of it. He is, like Arthur, a child of a fated, magical deception. He is Lancelot's blood, but he is cleansed, a new model Lancelot, possessing all his father's peerless skill at arms, but untouched by his father's fatal flaw. He is raised not at court, but in a convent, educated by nuns, shielded from the world and its temptations. He is a living, breathing allegory. Galahad's arrival at Camelot is the moment the old order is officially displaced. It happens on the very day of the Pentecostal feast Just before the Grail itself appears, a mysterious old man, cloaked in white, leads the young, unarmed Galahad into the great hall. Galahad is cloaked in red armor, a symbol of Christ's passion. The old man leads him to the one fatal seat at the round table, the Siege Perilous, the seat that, remember, Merlin had reserved. It was the chair that would consume any unworthy man who sat in it. For a generation, it had sat empty. Galahad, with no fear, sits down. The knights watch in horror, expecting him to be destroyed. Instead, the magical inscription on the seat, which had simply read, Perilous, changes. It now reads, "This is the seat of Sir Galahad, the High Prince. He is the one. The test is over. The new hero has arrived, and immediately all the old hierarchies are rendered meaningless. He is given a sword pulled from a different stone floating in a river. He is given a shield, a holy relic, and when the Grail appears and the quest begins, Galahad is its designated hero. This is the mainstream fact of his character. He is not, in a modern sense, a character at all. He is an idea. He is a 13th century Cistercian monk's dream of the perfect man. He is humble, pious, and most importantly, a virgin. He has no inner conflict. He has no doubts. He does not struggle with temptation in the way Lancelot does. He is simply immune to it. He rides through the wasteland like a visitor from another plane of existence, shielded by his own purity, while Gawain, the worldly knight, gets lost, fights pointless duels, and fails. Galahad simply succeeds. Demons cannot tempt him. Evil knights cannot defeat him. He is a guided missile, aimed by God at the heart of the Grail's mystery. This brings us to the historiographic mystery. Why create such a perfect, and to many modern readers, such an inhumanly boring character? The hypothesis is that Galahad is a work of pure theological propaganda. The monastic authors hated the hero of the old French romances. They despised Lancelot and the adulterous courtly love he represented. They saw him as a poison. Galahad was the antidote. He was created for the specific purpose of displacing Lancelot, of showing the world a new kind of hero, a spiritual one. He is Lancelot's son, born to redeem his father's sin and to replace him as the best knight in the world. In the end, Galahad is one of only 3 knights who achieve the quest, accompanied by the pure Sir Percival and the steadfast Sir Bors, the only one of the 3 who was not a virgin, but was chaste after one youthful mistake. They reach the Grail Castle, they heal the Fisher King, and they are granted the ultimate vision. Galahad sees the Grail unveiled, and he beholds the divine mystery within. And in that moment of perfect ecstatic union with God, he has a final request. He has seen perfection. He cannot, he says, bear to return to the flawed, sinful world. He prays for death. And as he prays, his soul is taken from his body by a host of angels and carried up to the spiritual city, Gadishnal. Galahad's victory is the ultimate Cistercian message. True salvation is not found in fixing the world, as Arthur tries to do, but in leaving it. He wins, but he does not return. His success is for Camelot a terrible, final loss. The Grail was gone. Galahad, the perfect spiritual knight, had ascended to heaven, taking the holy vessel with him, and in doing so, he had taken the very soul of Camelot. The quest had been a terrible, clarifying fire. It had revealed the spiritual hollowness at the heart of the perfect court. The knights who stumbled back to the round table, men like Sir Bors and a humbled, broken Lancelot were not victorious heroes. They were the survivors. They had seen the face of God, been judged, and been found wanting. The fellowship was shattered, its purpose fulfilled, and in its fulfillment, extinguished. Arthur's court, which had been built on the dream of worldly perfection, was now just a court. The high ideals were gone, and into that vacuum, all the old, human, and very messy problems came rushing back in. The love between Lancelot and Guinevere, which had been paused by the spiritual terror of the quest, resumed. But now it was no longer a secret, passionate thrill. It was a joyless, guilty habit, a bond of shared trauma. The court, once so bright, had entered its twilight. The air was thick with suspicion, bitterness, and the knowledge of failure. The knights, having failed the test of God, turned on each other. The great age of adventure was over. The age of intrigue, factionalism, and retribution was about to begin, and from the shadows, an antagonist emerges who is not a Saxon invader, a Roman emperor, or a magical beast. The final fatal enemy of Camelot is not an outsider. It is family. It is Arthur's half-sister, a woman who has been lurking at the edges of the story from the very beginning. A woman of profound power, intelligence, and a deep, festering, and perhaps justifiable rage. She is Morgan Le Fay. Her evolution is one of the strangest and most fascinating mysteries in the entire legend. If we go all the way back to Geoffrey of Monmouth, back to the Historia Regum Britannia, we find a Morgan who is not a villain at all. In fact, she is Arthur's savior. Geoffrey, and his later adapter in the Vita Merlini, Life of Merlin, describes her as the eldest of 9 magical sisters, a learned and benevolent ruler, the queen of the Insula Avalonis, the Isle of Apples. This is Avalon, and she is a most wondrous healer. In Geoffrey's original ending, when Arthur is mortally wounded at the Battle of Camlan, he is not taken to a grave. He is carried onto a barge and taken to the Isle of Avalon, so that his wounds might be healed. He is delivered into the care of his sister, Morgan, the one person in the world who has the magical knowledge to save him. She is his last, best hope. So what then happened? How did this benevolent, magical healer queen, this figure of salvation, transform into the 13th century Cistercian author's vision of a dark, malevolent, and demonic sorceress? This is the great historiographic mystery of her character. The answer is a complex brew of theology, narrative necessity, and simple, profound misogyny. The monastic authors of the French Vulgate cycle were deeply, profoundly suspicious of powerful, educated women. In their black and white world, a woman who wielded power, who understood magic, which could just be advanced knowledge of herbalism and astronomy, and who operated outside the direct control of the church, was, by definition, an agent of the devil. A female healer was a witch. A female ruler was an abomination. Morgan, with her pre-Christian Celtic roots, was a natural target. She was the perfect foil, the anti-Mary, the pagan female intellectual who could be blamed for the court's downfall, but they also gave her a new, devastating, and far more human motive. The French romances rewrote her biography. She was no longer just Arthur's sister. She was, specifically, the daughter of Igraine and her first husband, the Duke Gaulois. This changes everything. This means that Arthur, her half-brother, is the living, breathing symbol of her father's murder and her mother's rape by deception. Arthur is the child of the sin that destroyed her world, the child of Uther Pendragon and the magic of Merlin. Her hatred of Arthur is no longer a random act of evil. It is a vendetta. It is a quest for justice, or at least revenge, for the original foundational crime that made Camelot possible. In these later romances, Morgan becomes the anti-Merlin, where Merlin, her one-time teacher, used his magic to build and protect Arthur's kingdom. Morgan now uses her magic to expose and destroy it. She becomes the great, agonizing truth-teller of the court. She knows about Lancelot and Guinevere. She sees the rot, the hypocrisy at the heart of the fellowship, and she makes it her life's work to drag that secret into the light. She sends a magical testing horn to court, one from which only a faithful wife can drink without spilling. She tries to trick Arthur's knights. She even, at one point, paints the entire graphic story of Lancelot's affair in a series of murals in a remote chapel, hoping her brother will one day stumble upon it and finally see the truth. Her very name, Le Fay, is French for the fairy, or more ominously, the Fat. It connects her to the fates of classical myth, the three sisters who spin, measure, and cut the thread of human life, and that is her true role. She is not just a disgruntled sister. She is an agent of destiny. She is the embodiment of that original dark conception at Tintagel, returned to ensure that the kingdom built on that sin will inevitably and justly be brought to ruin by it. She is the nemesis of Guinevere, the dark queen to the light, and her relentless, magical scheming will provide the fuel for the final tragic civil war that is to come. The Grail was gone. The spiritual heart of Camelot had been ripped out, and the survivors, Lancelot chief among them, were now just men waiting for the end. The court was in its twilight, and the old bonds, once so strong, were fraying, poisoned by the memory of their collective failure, and the now undeniable hypocrisy of the king's best knight and his queen. But while Lancelot was the tragic French imported hero, and Galahad was the divine monastic invention, there was another man at that table. A man who had been there from the beginning, a man whose story is perhaps the most complex of all. Arthur's own nephew, the loyal, brave, and deeply human Sir Gawain. Gawain's journey is a perfect mirror of the legend's own evolution. He begins, in the very oldest Welsh traditions, as a totally different person. He is Gwalchmai, the Hawk of May. In these pre-Geoffrey fragments, he is not just a warrior, he is a peacemaker, the golden-tongued hero whose courtesy and wisdom are as famous as his strength. In some traditions, he is a solar hero, his power mystically waxing in the morning to its peak at noon and waning as the sun set. He was, in short, the original native-born British hero of the court, a figure of balance and light. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in his Historia, keeps Gawain's central role. He is Arthur's right-hand man, his most trusted and beloved nephew. He is a figure of immense martial prowess, a leading general in the Great War against Rome. He is fiery, loyal, and in the end, tragic. Geoffrey's Gawain dies not in the final battle, but at the very start of the Civil War, cut down by Mordred's men as Arthur's army makes its landing. His death is a raw, brutal, and profoundly personal wound for Arthur, the first crack in the king's own soul. But then, as we've seen, the French Romance writers, led by Chrétien de Troyes, took over, and they had a problem. They wanted to introduce their new, complex hero, Lancelot. To make Lancelot the best knight in the world, they had to, by definition, demote the man who held that title, Gawain. And so, in the French romances, Gawain's character begins to curdle. He remains brave, courteous, and unfailingly loyal to Arthur, but he becomes a foil. He becomes the perfect worldly knight, the man who knows all the rules of chivalry, but none of the heart. He is often portrayed as a notorious womanizer, a man who is the knight of all ladies, but the lover of none, a shallow contrast to Lancelot's profound world-ending passion for Guinevere. He is the static, by-the-book hero against whom the new, more psychologically complex knights, like Ivan or Percival, must be measured. His absolute lowest point comes, as we've seen, during the Grail quest. The monastic authors of the Cuesta del Sangral absolutely despised him. To them, Gawain was the living symbol of the old, failed, sinful, worldly chivalry. He was, remember, the one who made the rash, prideful vow to see the Grail unveiled, turning a spiritual gift into a worldly trophy hunt. While Galahad and Percival ride a path of divine grace, Gawain wanders the wasteland, totally lost. He is depicted as angry, proud, and spiritually blind. He fights pointless duels. He kills fellow knights by accident. And at one point, a hermit literally reads him the riot act, calling him a wicked and faithless servant, and telling him he has been disbarred from the quest by God himself. He is the great failure, the man who proves that the original ideals of the Round Table are not enough. And this is where his story should end. A demoted hero, a spiritual failure. But it doesn't. And this is the great historiographic mystery of his character. While the French authors were casting him aside, a new literary tradition was emerging back in England. And the English loved Gawain. He was their hero. He was the British-born Hawk of May, not the French import Lancelot. They remembered the older traditions. And in the late 14th century, an anonymous poet, a contemporary of Chaucer, wrote the single greatest, most complex, and most beautiful poem of the entire Arthurian tradition. It is called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This poem is a masterpiece of psychological depth, and it exists to redeem Gawain, to explore what his brand of chivalry, his trothu, a Middle English word meaning truth, loyalty, and plighted word, really means. The story is a test. A monstrous green magical knight crashes Arthur's Christmas feast and offers a beheading game. He will allow any knight to chop off his head, on the condition that in 1 year, that knight must find him at the Green Chapel and receive the same blow. Gawain, in his loyalty, accepts the challenge for the king and cuts off the giant's head. The Green Knight, in a terrifying display, simply picks up his own head, tells Gawain to find him in a year, and rides out. The rest of the poem is not an adventure. It's a moral crucible. Gawain's journey to the chapel is a test, not of his strength, but of his integrity. He stays at a remote castle with the jovial Lord Bertilac, who proposes a game. For 3 days, Bertilac will go hunting, and he will give Gawain whatever he wins. In return, Gawain must give Bertilac whatever he wins in the castle. And for 3 days, Bertilac's beautiful, witty, and very forward wife comes to Gawain's bedchamber and tries to seduce him. This is the real trap. Gawain is caught between 2 pillars of his own code. His courtesy. He cannot be rude or ungracious to the lady, and his loyalty. He cannot, will not, betray his host. He is the anti-Lancelot. And for 2 days, he brilliantly, wittily, politely threads the needle, accepting only a kiss or two, which he faithfully gives to Lord Bertilac that evening. But on the third day, terrified of his impending execution, his resolve cracks. The lady offers him a green silk girdle, a sash, which, she claims, is magical and will prevent any man from harming him. Gawain, in a moment of pure, understandable, human fear, accepts the girdle. And that night, he breaks his vow. He gives Bertilac the kisses he won, but he hides the sash. He lies to save his life. He goes to the Green Chapel. The Green Knight reveals himself to be Lord Bertilac. The whole test, an elaborate magical scheme by, who else? Morgan Le Fay. He swings his axe. He faints twice, honoring the 2 days Gawain was honest. The third time, the axe just nicks Gawain's neck, drawing a single drop of blood, a tiny wound for a tiny sin. Gawain is not dead. He is just flawed, and he is mortified. He is consumed by shame. He has failed his own perfect code of troth. He returns to Camelot, and in a gesture of profound self-loathing, he vows to wear the green girdle forever as a badge of his failure. But when he tells the court, they don't agree. They laugh. Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table laugh with love and relief. They do not see his failure. They see his humanity. In a final, beautiful gesture of solidarity, the entire court votes to wear a green sash, not as a badge of shame, to honor Gawain and his journey. This poem gives us the final greatest Gawain, not a saint like Galahad, not a tragic adulterer like Lancelot. He is the human knight, the man who tries his absolute best to be perfect, fails in a small, relatable way, and has the grace to be utterly ashamed of it. He is, in the end, the one they all choose to emulate. The court of Camelot had, in a sense, found a fragile peace in its own imperfection. Sir Gawain's human, relatable failure, and the court's loving acceptance of it, had offered a moment of grace, a way to live on, even after the spiritual perfection of the Grail had departed. But a kingdom founded on a sin of deception and a prophecy of doom cannot be saved by a green sash. The Grail was gone. The spiritual center was missing. The fellowship was now just a collection of flawed, aging, and increasingly bitter men. The twilight was deepening, and the old, unspoken wounds of the court's founding were beginning to fester. The great, overarching plan of Merlin was complete, and now the great, overarching consequence, which he had also foretold, was due. The tragedy needed its final agent. It needed more than just a magical schemer like Morgan Le Fay. It needed an actor, a man with a claim, a grievance, and a destiny. It needed the man whose name, in the very first fragments of the legend, was bound to Arthur's, not in life, but in death. His name was Mordred, in the very earliest, bleakest mention of Arthur's end. That entry in the 10th century Annales Cambriae, the one we looked at so long ago, the entry is stark. The Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell. That is all. Medrawd, the Welsh form of Mordred. It doesn't say he was a traitor. It doesn't say he was Arthur's nephew or his son. It just says they fell together. In some of the Welsh triads, Medrawd is even listed as one of the 3 unrestrained ravagings of the Isle of Britain when he came to Arthur's own court, left not so much as a scrap of food, and dragged Gwenwyfar from her royal chair and struck her. It is an act of profound, brutal insult. He is a problem, a raider, a source of chaos. But the motive is missing. It was Geoffrey of Monmouth, our great inventor, who gave that chaos a political shape. He is the one who makes Mordred, or Modredus, as he calls him, a part of the family, and in doing so, makes the betrayal so much more intimate and terrible. In Geoffrey's Historia, Mordred is Arthur's nephew. He is the son of Arthur's sister, named Anna in this version, and her husband, King Lot of Orkney. This makes him the full, legitimate brother of the man we just met, Sir Gawain. This is the mainstream fact of his first coherent biography. He is a trusted member of the family, and this is what allows for the ultimate treason. When Arthur, at the height of his power, remember, sails off to fight the fictional Roman Emperor Lucius, he does what any king would do. He leaves the kingdom in the hands of a regent, and he chooses his trusted nephew, Mordred. This is the fatal mistake. While Arthur is on the continent, winning his greatest victories, Mordred acts. He does not just seize the crown, he forges alliances with the Saxons, the very enemies his uncle had spent a lifetime defeating. And in the ultimate symbolic act of usurpation, he traitorously and incestuously takes Queen Guinevere as his own. This is the treason that forces Arthur to abandon his Roman conquest and return home, not to a parade, but to a civil war. But this, for later writers, was still not enough. Geoffrey's Mordred is ambitious, he is a traitor. But why? Why would the brother of the loyal Sir Gawain do this? The 13th century Cistercian authors of the Vulgate Cycle, those same men who gave us the Grail Quest and Galahad, looked at this and saw another opportunity to weave their dark, complex tapestry of sin and retribution. They reached all the way back, past the Grail, past Lancelot, past the founding of the Round Table, to the very first days of Arthur's reign. And they planted a seed of doom so dark it eclipses all others. They rewrote his origin. This is the great, terrifying historiographic mystery of Mordred. In the Vulgate Cycle, Mordred is not Arthur's nephew. He is his son. And he is his incestuous son. The story is a dark mirror of Uther's sin. Arthur, a young king, just crowned, is visited by a beautiful queen, Morgause, the wife of King Lot. She is, though Arthur does not know it, his own half-sister, the daughter of Igraine and Gaulois, the sister of Morgan le Fay. In a moment of youthful, ignorant lust, a sin born not of malice, but of sheer, fated ignorance, Arthur sleeps with his sister. That night, the prophecy is born. Merlin, in a state of terror, comes to the king and reveals the truth. "You have done a great sin," he says, "and you have begotten a child. And that child is destined to be your ruin. He will grow up to kill you with his own hands and destroy all that you hold dear." Arthur, the perfect king, is horrified. But he does not react with penance. He reacts with fear and with a cruelty that the legend rarely admits. He tries to defy fate. He becomes, for one terrible moment, King Herod. He commands that all noble children born on May Day, the prophesied day of the child's birth, be rounded up, and he has them all put onto a ship without a crew and set adrift on the open sea to die. It is perhaps the single most unchivalric, most evil act of Arthur's entire life. A sin of calculated political murder. But fate cannot be cheated. The ship is wrecked in a storm, and all the children drown, except one. A single infant, Mordred, is washed ashore, where he is found by a good man and raised in secret, ignorant of his true lineage. He survives because of Arthur's attempt to kill him. His life is a miracle, but a dark one. This is the masterstroke of the Vulgate authors. Mordred is no longer just an ambitious nephew. He is a consequence. He is a child of destiny, a living, breathing, walking embodiment of Arthur's own hidden sin. He is the snake in the garden, and Arthur himself, in his own moment of lust and his own moment of fear, is the one who put him there. He is the dark shadow to Galahad's light. Galahad was the innocent son of Lancelot's sin, born to redeem the court. Mordred is the innocent son of Arthur's sin, born to destroy it. He eventually makes his way to Camelot, his identity unknown. He becomes a knight, but he is a dark, cruel, and cynical one. He is the one who sees the hypocrisy of the court most clearly. He is the one who hates Lancelot, not because he is a sinner, but because he is a hypocrite. He is the one who, along with his brother Sir Agravain, finally forces the Lancelot-Guinevere affair into the open, setting the stage for the final bloody act. His treason, when it comes, is not just a grab for power. It is fate come full circle. It is the original sin of the kingdom, the child of lust and fear returning home to claim his inheritance of fire and death. The tragedy, once set in motion, was now moving with the terrible grinding speed of an avalanche. Mordred, that living, breathing consequence of Arthur's oldest sin, had, along with his brother Sir Agravain, finally laid the trap. They had forced the truth of Lancelot and Guinevere into the open, catching the night in the Queen's chamber. And in that one chaotic, desperate night, Lancelot, fighting for his life, had done the unforgivable. He had killed Sir Agravain, and worse, he had, by tragic accident, cut down the unarmed noble and beloved brothers of Sir Gawain, Gareth, and Gaheris. This was the blow that finally, irrevocably, broke the fellowship. The love of Gawain, remember, that loyal hawk of May, for his kinsman was the only thing stronger than his love for Lancelotto. His heart, once the most courteous in the world, was calcified by a grief so profound it became a kind of madness. He turned the full, terrifying force of his rage and his grief not on Mordred, the schemer, but on Lancelot, the killer. It was Gawain's thirst for vengeance that drove King Arthur, against his own weeping protests, into a pointless, tragic civil war. The king was forced to besiege his best knight in his castle in France, and it was here, as the last dregs of the Round Table were spilling their blood on foreign soil, that Mordred made his move. He was the son of prophecy, the child Arthur had tried to murder, and he had been waiting. Just as Geoffrey of Monmouth had written, Mordred, left as regent, declared that Arthur was dead. He seized the crown, he forged alliances with the hated Saxons, and he declared that he would take Queen Guinevere as his wife. The news struck Arthur's camp like a thunderbolt. The war with Lancelot was instantly forgotten. It had all been a diversion, a terrible, pointless squandering of strength, and Arthur, his heart sick, knew it. He gathered his remaining army and sailed back to Britain to reclaim his land. The landing at Dover was not a homecoming. It was an invasion. Mordred and his new Saxon allies were there, waiting on the beaches. And in the bloody, chaotic battle on the shore, Sir Gawain, still fighting at the front, was struck down. He was carried to the king's tent, a mortal wound in his head. And in those last terrible hours, the rage finally broke. The madness of his grief ebbed, and he saw with perfect, agonizing clarity what his pride had done. He saw that Lancelot was the victim, that Mordred was the enemy, and that he, Gawain, had forced his king's hand and destroyed the world. He used his last breath to write a letter to Lancelot, a note of profound, heartbreaking contrition, begging his old friend to forgive him and to come, with all haste, to save the king. And then, at noon, the hour of his greatest strength, the Hawk of May died in his uncle's arms. Arthur was now truly alone. He had lost his nephew, his best knight, his wife, and his kingdom. All that was left was the prophecy. All that was left was the end. He marched his army west into the ancient heartland of Cornwall, pushing Mordred's forces back to a single predetermined spot. The night before the final battle, Arthur fell into a haunted sleep. He dreamt, as Sir Thomas Malory tells it, a vision of terrible, final clarity. He saw himself sitting on a throne atop a great wheel, the wheel of fortune. And in an instant, the wheel turned. His throne plunged downward, and he was cast into a pit, a dark, churning water filled with serpents and wild beasts. It was the prophecy made manifest. His end was here. The two armies, what was left of the British dream, met on a plain near the sea. The name of the field was Camlan. This is the oldest, hardest, and most mainstream fact of the legend's end. That 10th century scrap of parchment, the Annales Cambriae, states it with brutal simplicity. The Battle of Camlan, in which Arthur and Medrawd fell. It doesn't, in that first telling, even say they were enemies. It just says they fell, bound together in a shared doom. But in the romances, this is the apocalypse. There was one last, desperate attempt at peace. Arthur and Mordred agreed to parley, to meet in the center of the field, each with a small guard, to sign a treaty. But the trust was gone. Both men, paranoid and broken, gave their armies a secret, fatal command. If you see any sword drawn, for any reason, sound the charge. The two kings met in the cold, tense quiet. They stood face to face, the father and the incestuous son, the sin and the consequence, the king and the traitor. They hammered out a truce. The war, it seemed, was over. And in that moment, as the treaty was being signed, a single tiny adder, a snake, a symbol of that first ancient sin in another garden, slithered out of the grass and bit a knight on the foot. The knight, in a moment of thoughtless, animal reflex, yelped in pain and drew his sword to kill the snake. It was enough. A single glint of polished steel in the morning light. On both sides of the field, the trumpets screamed. It was not a battle. It was a mutual, suicidal execution. It was the delete key being pressed on the entire legend. They fought all day, a pure, formless, unchivalric slaughter. There were no quests here, no mercy, no honor. It was just the sound of steel on bone, the screams of dying men, the tearing of banners. The fellowship of the Round Table, the dream of a new age, died in the mud. By sunset, a terrible, bloody silence had fallen. The field was a ruin, a sea of the dead. King Arthur, wounded, weeping, stood leaning on his spear. Of his entire army, only 2 knights remained alive, Sir Lucan and his brother, Sir Bedivere. And across the field, by a pile of shattered shields and dead men, stood one other figure, Mordred. The prophecy. "Give me my spear," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse. Sir Bedivere, seeing the king's eyes, begged him, "My lord, let him be. The day is won. He is spent. Remember your dream." But Arthur was no longer a man. He was a king, and he was a destiny. "Now," he roared, "traitor, thy death day is come." He gripped his spear, Ron, and charged. He ran, with all his remaining strength, at his son. He struck Mordred with such force that the spearhead punched through his armor, through his body. and a shaft of sunlight, as the legend says, shone through the wound. Mordred, in his death agony, knew he was finished. But he was the child of doom, and he would have his due. With his last inhuman strength, he pushed himself up the spear shaft, past the blade, until he was chest to chest with the king, and he raised his own sword, and with one final apocalyptic blow, he struck Arthur full on the side of the head, cutting through the helmet, through the skull. Mordred fell dead. Arthur fell to his knees. He was mortally wounded. The fellowship was broken. The king was fallen. And the long, cold night began to settle on the field of Camlan. The field was silent, save for the groan of dying men. Mordred, the child of prophecy, lay dead, cleft in two. And King Arthur, the king of prophecy, lay dying, his skull shattered by that final apocalyptic blow. The dream of Camelot was over, drowned in the blood of its own fellowship. Sir Lucan, his guts spilling onto the cold earth from trying to lift his king, had died, his heart bursting in a last terrible act of loyalty. And now, on the vast dark plain of Camlan, only one knight remained. Not Lancelot, the greatest, not Galahad, the purest, not Gawain, the most courteous. It was Sir Bedivere, the bold, the one-handed, the man who, in the old Welsh tales, had been with Arthur from the very beginning. He was the last. Arthur, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps, knew he had only moments. The world was fading, the prophecy fulfilled. But one last piece of magic remained, one final task. His sword, the great Excalibur, was still in his hand, its blade dark with his son's blood. This sword was not of the human world. It had been, as the romances told, a gift from the Lady of the Lake, a symbol of the magical pact between Arthur's kingdom and the ancient, watery pre-Christian powers of the land. It could not be left here, to be looted by Saxon raiders or pagan opportunists. It had to be returned. "Take my good sword, Excalibur," Arthur whispered to Bedivere, "and go with it to that water's side, and throw my sword in that water, and come again and tell me what thou there seest." Bedivere, weeping, took the sword from his king. He stumbled away through the fields of the dead to the edge of a great, misty lake, and he looked at the sword. He looked at the Chwelt, a masterpiece of gold and silver, encrusted with a constellation of precious stones, glittering in the faint moonlight. And he thought, this is it. This is the last symbol of the kingdom. This is the memory of all our glory. To throw this away, it is a sin. It is waste. He could not do it. He was a man, and he was attached to the things of the world. He hid the sword under a clump of reeds and returned to the king. "What saw thou there?" Arthur whispered. Bedivere, the loyal knight, lied. "My lord," he said, "I saw nothing but the winds blow upon the waves." Arthur's eyes, clouded with death, flashed with a cold, clear anger. "Ah, traitor, untrue," he breathed. "Now thou hast betrayed me twice. Thou art named a noble knight, and wouldst betray me for the riches of a sword. This is the final heartbreaking tragedy of the Round Table. Its last act is a betrayal, a lie born not of malice, but of a very human inability to let go of the past, to let go of the symbols of glory." Shamed, Bedivere ran back. He picked up the sword. He felt its impossible weight. He looked again at the jewels, and again his human heart failed him. He hid it a second time, and a second time he lied to his dying king. "I saw nothing but the water wap and waves wan," he said. A beautiful, poetic lie. Arthur, in his final agony, raged. "Ah, traitor! Now go again lightly, for thy long tarrying putteth me in great jeopardy of my life. Bedivere, his soul broken, finally understood. This was not a request. It was an order from a different world. He ran to the lake, and with a great cry, he shut his eyes and threw the sword, jewels and all, in a high flashing arc out over the dark water. And then, the miracle. Before the blade could strike the surface, there came an arm and a hand above the water. It was, as Mallory describes, clad in white samite, mystical and wonderful. The hand caught the sword by the hilt, brandished it 3 times, shaking it in the air, a sign of acknowledgement, a pact fulfilled. And then, as silently as it had appeared, the hand and the arm slipped back beneath the surface. The magic was gone. The circle was closed. Bedivere ran back to Arthur and told him what he had seen. And the king's face softened. "Ah," he whispered, "help me from hence, for I have tarried over long." Bedivere, the last knight, gathered his king into his arms and carried him, stumbling, to that same water's edge. And there, nosing against the shore, was a black barge. It was filled with fair ladies, all in black hoods, and they were weeping. And among them, as Mallory tells it, was a queen. It was Arthur's sister, Morgan Le Fay. This is the final profound historiographic mystery. Morgan, the sorceress, the truth-teller, the woman who had schemed to destroy her brother, had now returned. She was no longer the villain. She had reverted to her oldest, truest self, the one Geoffrey of Monmouth first described, the Queen of Avalon, the magical healer. The vendetta was over. The prophecy was complete. All that was left was family and magic. "Ah, dear brother," she said, "why have ye tarried so long?" They laid the king gently in the barge, and as it began to push off from the shore, Arthur looked back at the weeping Bedivere, the last man of his broken world. "Comfort thyself," the king said, "for in me is no trust for to trust in. For I will into the vale of Avilion to heal me of my grievous wound." This is the end, and it is not an end. It is an ambiguity. This is the mainstream fact of the legend. Arthur does not die. He is taken away. But where? What is Avalon, the Insula Avalonis, the Isle of Apples? For Geoffrey, it was a magical pagan otherworld, ruled by 9 sisters, a place outside of time. But for later Christianized England, this was a problem. A hero had to have a grave. And so, in 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey, in Somerset, a place that was anciently, in a time of great floods, an isle surrounded by water, made a stunning announcement. They had been digging, and they had found it. They had found a massive, hollowed-out oak coffin, and inside the bones of a giant of a man and a smaller skeleton with a scrap of golden hair, and with it a lead cross inscribed in Latin: "Cec iacit sepultus inclitus rex Arturius in Insula Avalonia." Here lies, buried the famous King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon. This was almost certainly a politically motivated discovery. King Henry II was at war with the Welsh, who held to the fiery belief that Arthur was not dead, that he was sleeping, and that he would return to lead them against their English oppressors. The Glastonbury grave was a brilliant piece of propaganda. It was the king and the church saying, "Stop waiting. He's dead. Here is the body. The dream is over." But the dream was stronger than the monks. The ambiguity that Geoffrey had planted. His end shall be a matter of doubt. And the promise Mallory had Arthur speak, "I will, to heal me was too powerful. The myth refused the grave. And so, on that faked, politically convenient grave, Mallory himself, writing his great book centuries later, adds one last defiant, immortal sentence. Yet some men say, in many parts of England, that King Arthur is not dead, but shall come again. I will not say it shall be so, but rather I will say, here in this world he changed his life. But many men say that there is written upon his tomb this verse, Rex quondam, rexque futurus, that final, haunting, and defiant epitaph, Rex quondam, rexque futurus, the once king and the future king, is perhaps the most powerful sentence in the entire legend. It is the line that guarantees the story will never truly be over. But that line, like the black barge, the weeping queens, and the final tragic duel, did not just rise from the mist. It was written in English by a man who was, in his own way, as trapped as the king he was writing about. The entire, sweeping, cradle-to-grave story that we think of as the definitive legend, the one that contains all the elements we've discussed. The sword in the stone, the dark conception, the round table, the adultery of Lancelot, the purity of Galahad, and the final apocalyptic battle. All of it comes to us through the work of one man. He was not a Welsh bard, a French poet, or a Latin-speaking monk. He was a 15th century English knight. And he was a prisoner, writing from the heart of his own wasteland. His name was Sir Thomas Malory, and he is the single most important synthesizer of the myth. His book, which he called The Whole Book of King Arthur and of His Noble Knights of the Round Table, is the trunk of the Arthurian tree, the source from which nearly all modern branches grow. And who was this man? This is the great historiographic mystery of the late medieval period. For centuries, he was just a name, a knight prisoner who, in the final famous lines of his book, begs us to pray for my good deliverance. It was only in the 20th century that scholars, digging through old court records, found a candidate, a man who fits the time and the description, a Sir Thomas Malory of Newbold Revel in Warwickshire. And the mainstream fact of this man's life is complicated. To put it gently, he was no Galahad. The historical records from the 1450s paint a picture of a man of profound violence, a man caught up in the brutal, chaotic, and loyalty-fracturing civil war we now call the Wars of the Roses. This Malory was accused of a staggering list of crimes: extortion, cattle raiding, robbery, attempted murder, and even violently ravishing a woman named Joan Smith, a charge that, while horrifying, was also a common political smear in that lawless age. He was, in short, a man of his time, a soldier, a landlord, and perhaps a thug, who had seen the fellowship of the English nobility, his own world, eat itself alive in a real-life Camlan. This, then, is the most powerful hypothesis. This violent, disillusioned, and broken knight was captured by his political enemies, the Yorkists. He was thrown into prison, perhaps Newgate in London, and there he sat for years as his world crumbled outside. And in that cold, damp cell, he began to read. He got his hands on the great books of French, those massive, sprawling 13th century prose romances, the Vulgate and post-Vulgate cycles. These were the books, handwritten and absurdly expensive, that told the full story. The ones that had introduced Lancelot, invented Galahad, and built the mystical Grail quest. What Malory did was not an act of invention. It was an act of translation, of curation, of love. He was a man looking at the ruin of his own chivalric ideals and he saw a perfect, tragic mirror in these ancient stories. He took the sprawling, almost unreadably complex French epics, with their endless branching side quests and their dense Cistercian theological lectures, and he began to edit. With a soldier's practical eye, he cut away the fat. He streamlined the narrative, focusing, with a knight's heart, on the things that mattered to him: the brotherhood, the loyalty, the great tournaments, the impossible choices, the human tragic passion of Lancelot and Guinevere, and the final inevitable death of Arthur that came from it all. He wrote in a new, muscular, and wonderfully direct English prose. He didn't just translate, he recentered the story. The French monastic authors had despised Lancelot, remember? They had created Galahad to replace him. Mallory, the old soldier, would have none of it. He brushed aside the monkish judgment. In his book, Lancelot is restored. He is the flower of all knights, a man flawed, yes, a sinner, yes, but noble, generous, and loving to his core. Mallory's book is an act of profound nostalgia, a desperate lament for a nobler world that he knew better than anyone had never truly existed. He was writing about Camelot, but he was thinking about England. He finished his work around 1469. He gave it to a scribe. And then, in 1471, Sir Thomas Malory died, still a prisoner. And that should have been it. His massive 8-book manuscript, his life's work, could have easily been lost, scattered, or simply left to rot in a damp monastic library. A footnote in history. But in 1485, a second miracle happened. A copy of that manuscript found its way into the hands of a man named William Caxton. Caxton was a merchant, a pragmatist, and the man who had just brought a revolutionary new technology to England from Germany, the printing press. Caxton was looking for content, for books that would sell. And in Mallory's manuscript, he saw a blockbuster. It was a single, coherent, epic adventure, full of war, magic, love, and tragedy. And most importantly, it was in English. Caxton, the businessman, took Mallory's 8 books, which had titles like The Tale of Sir Lancelot and The Book of the Grail, and he combined them into one. He gave it a single, brilliant, French-sounding, and deeply melancholy title that would define it forever: Le Mort d'Arthur. The Death of Arthur. This printed book, Caxton's 1485 edition, is the reason we know this story. The massive, handwritten French originals were never printed. They were forgotten, left to gather dust. Mallory's version, now available, affordable, and accessible, became the version. It became the canon. For the next 400 years, when anyone from poets to playwrights wanted to tell the story of King Arthur, they didn't go back to Nennius. They didn't hunt down the Annales Cambriae. They picked up a copy of Le Mort d'Arthur. Mallory, the 15th century knight prisoner, had reached back across 1,000 years, gathered all the scattered, glittering fragments of the myth, and forged them into the single, immortal story that was now, finally, complete. The story was bound. It was in print. It was ready for the modern world. But first, just like its king, it would have to sleep for a very long time. Sir Thomas Malory, the knight prisoner, had gathered the threads, and William Caxton, the printer, had woven them into the first great, accessible, English-language version of the story. Le Mort d'Arthur, printed in 1485, was the definitive text. It was the high watermark, the final, glorious synthesis of the entire medieval legend. And then, the king slept. Just as Arthur himself had vanished into Avalon, the legend of Arthur went into a long, deep, and profound hibernation. For nearly 400 years, he was, in a literary sense, gone. The world moved on. The Renaissance, with its explosive rediscovery of classical Greece and Rome, had little patience for what it saw as a barbaric and Gothic past. Men were interested in Julius Caesar, not a misty British warlord. The 17th century, a time of revolution and puritanical zeal, saw the story as morally suspect, full of popish magic and ungodly adultery. And the 18th century, the great Age of Reason, was the most hostile of all. Men like Voltaire and David Hume, who believed in logic, science, and the cold, hard light of empirical truth, looked at the Arthurian legend, with its ladies and lakes, its magical swords, its prophecies and quests, and saw nothing but a childish, superstitious, and utterly embarrassing fairy tale. Arthur, in the mind of the Enlightenment, was a failure of the intellect, and so he lay dormant. Mallory's book was still read, but it was an antique, a curiosity. And then the 19th century happened, and the world was, once again, ending. A new kind of Saxon invasion was underway, not of longships, but of factories. This was the Industrial Revolution, and it was creating a wasteland far more real and far more toxic than any the medieval poets had imagined. The sky over London, Manchester, and Birmingham was black with coal smoke. The rivers ran thick with chemical dye and human filth. A new, impoverished, and desperate urban class was packed into slums, their lives governed not by the seasons, but by the shriek of the factory whistle and the relentless, pounding metallic rhythm of the machine. The old pastoral agrarian world was being devoured, and the new aristocracy, the men who were getting rich from this, the ironmongers and the mill owners, felt a profound, unspoken, and very deep spiritual anxiety. They had conquered the world with their machines and their empires, but they had, perhaps, lost their souls. This new, chaotic, and terrified age needed a myth. They were nostalgic for a past, a merry old England that had never really existed. They needed a story that could provide a moral compass, a code of conduct for their new, rootless, and confusing world. They needed a hero. And so, the sleeping king awoke. The man who awoke him was the new bard of the age, the poet laureate of Great Britain, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson, like Mallory before him, was a man obsessed. He saw in the Arthurian legend a perfect empty vessel into which he could pour all the moral anxieties and aspirations of his own time. Beginning in 1859, he published his own life's work, a series of 12 blank verse poems called Idylls of the King. This is the mainstream fact of the Great Victorian Revival. Tennyson took Mallory's earthy, muscular, often brutal, and morally ambiguous story, and he repackaged it. He draped it in heavy, beautiful, suffocatingly rich velvet. He turned the rough medieval fortress into a pristine, allegorical, stained-glass cathedral. His Arthur is not Mallory's warrior king. He is, as many have noted, a Victorian gentleman, and perhaps even a reflection of Tennyson's beloved deceased friend, Arthur Hallam, or Queen Victoria's own sainted husband, Prince Albert. Tennyson's Arthur is, above all, blameless. He is a perfect, passionless, almost Christ-like figure, a soul at war with sense. His entire purpose is to tame the beast in man, to create an empire not of conquest, but of order. He is the perfect symbol for the British Empire's idealized image of itself, a force for global civilization, bringing light, law, and God to the darker corners of the world. The knights, in turn, become models for the Victorian gentleman. Their chivalry is not Mallory's rough battlefield code. It is a code of extreme moral purity, of sexual self-restraint, of duty, and of pious, unquestioning faith. And the great sin that brings this new, perfect moral world crashing down is, of course, the love between Lancelot and Guinevere. In Mallory, this love is a tragedy. It is human, it is passionate, and Mallory, the old soldier, seems to forgive them for it. In Tennyson, it is an unforgivable crime. It is the triumph of sense over soul. It is the snake in the garden, the selfish animal passion that poisons the entire perfect civilized project. Tennyson's Guinevere, in particular, becomes a classic fallen woman of Victorian melodrama, weeping in a nunnery, not because she was trapped in an impossible choice, but because she failed her great civilizing male leader. This brings us to the historiographic mystery. Why? Why did this medieval, magical, and deeply Catholic legend become the defining myth of the 19th century, the most industrial, Protestant, and rational empire on earth? The most powerful hypothesis is that it was the ultimate Gothic revival. The Victorians were reacting against the cold, boring logic of the 18th century and the ugly, functional squalor of their own century. They fell in love with the fantasy of the Middle Ages. They rebuilt their Houses of Parliament with Gothic spires. The pre-Raphaelite painters, like William Morris and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, painted scenes of Arthurian legend, all jewel-toned, languid, and deeply romantic. The medieval world became their safe space, a dream world of honor, faith, and chivalry that stood in perfect, stark contrast to the stock market and the steam engine. Tennyson's Idylls was the script for this new national fantasy. It was an instruction manual for the new industrial class on how to be noble. It was a story that told them that their new, confusing, money-driven world could, in fact, be a new Camelot, if only they could control their base passions, do their duty, and be more like the blameless king. Tennyson had saved the king, but in doing so, he had turned him into a statue. And as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, this moral, perfect, and rather sexless king would himself begin to feel as cold and as lifeless as the stone he was carved from. The world was about to enter a new, far more brutal age, and it would need a new and far more human Arthur. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, had rebuilt Camelot, but he had rebuilt it as a museum, a cold, moralizing, stained glass memorial. His blameless king was a statue, a Victorian ideal, a passionless symbol of duty and soul. And then, in 1914, the 20th century arrived, and the factories that Tennyson's age had built began to produce not just iron and textiles, but machine guns, mustard gas, and barbed wire. The Great War was not a chivalric joust. It was an industrial, anonymous, and incomprehensible slaughter. When the survivors came home from the trenches of the Somme, they looked at Tennyson's pristine, blameless king, and they could not see themselves. They could not see the mud, the shell shock, the moral ambiguity, the sheer grinding human failure of their own world. Tennyson's statue was irrelevant. If the king was to survive this new, brutal century, he had to be smashed open. He had to be made human again. The man who would do this, the man who would give the 20th century the Arthur it so desperately needed, was, like Mallory, a deeply troubled and isolated man. His name was T.H. White, an Englishman born in India, a writer, a scholar, and a man haunted by his own dark, violent impulses, White was, in many ways, an outcast. He was a man who deeply, profoundly, and academically hated war. As the storm clouds of a Second World War gathered over Europe in the 1930s, White, living in a small cottage, began to reread Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. And in that violent 15th century text, he found a perfect mirror for his own 20th century anxieties about power, justice, and the endless cyclical tragedy of human violence. His life's work, which he would eventually publish in 1958 as a single, magnificent volume, was The Once and Future King. And its mainstream fact is its central revolutionary thesis. It is a humanist reinterpretation. White looked at the legend not as a moral allegory like Tennyson, or a theological battleground like the Vulgate monks, but as a profound psychological and deeply human tragedy. And his great stroke of genius was to ask a question no one had ever truly asked before. What was Arthur like as a boy? This is White's grand invention. The first and most beloved book of his cycle is The Sword in the Stone. And here, Arthur is not a hidden royal prince. He is just what? He is an awkward, kind-hearted, insecure, and thoroughly decent foster boy living in the shadow of his arrogant older brother, Sir Kay. And his education is not in jousting or politics. It is in humanity. White's version of Merlin, or Merlin, as he spells him, is the book's other great invention. He is not Geoffrey's grim prophet or the Vulgate's kingmaker. He is a bumbling, absent-minded, and deeply wise old professor who, crucially, is living backward in time. He has already seen the 20th century. He has seen the trenches. He has seen the rise of fascism. And he is desperately, frantically trying to educate this one good-hearted boy to inoculate him against the very horrors Merlin knows are to come. His lessons are the heart of the book. He does not teach Ward history. He turns him into it. He uses his magic to transform the boy into a series of animals, forcing him to experience other forms of society, other forms of power. Ward becomes a fish in the castle moat, where he learns from the pike that the only rule is might is right, the philosophy of pure, absolute, totalitarian power. He becomes an ant in a colony, a world of perfect, mindless, fascist collectivism, where any ant who is not of their smell is an enemy to be liquidated. He becomes a wild goose, flying free, learning of a society with no war, no borders, and no concept of private property. He becomes a badger, a wise old philosopher who tells him that man, alone of all creatures, has been given dominion by God, and has tragically, consistently chosen to use it only for warfare. This is the historiographic mystery, or rather, the modern hypothesis of White's masterpiece. The Sword in the Stone is a profound anti-fascist and humanist political tract, disguised as a children's story. Merlin is educating Arthur, not to be a king, but to be a mensch. He is trying to create a leader who will see that might is right is the philosophy of the pike, the philosophy of Hitler, and that there must be another way. And so, when Watt, in that famous scene, pulls the sword from the stone, not through divine grace, but with the help of all the animals he has befriended, all the lessons he has learned, he is horrified. He doesn't want to be king. He just wants to be a good person. And that is why he must be king. The rest of White's tetralogy is the story of this good humanist king's great tragic failure. Arthur's big idea, born of Merlin's lessons, is to create the Round Table, a new order where might is not right, but might is used for right. He tries to channel the violent, thuggish energy of his knights into a force for justice, and for a while it works. But White, the 20th century realist, knows it cannot last. The flaw is not in the system, it is in the people. The Round Table, his perfect, rational idea, is ultimately destroyed by the one thing his education could not account for: the irrational, beautiful, and deeply human passion of Lancelot and Guinevere. White's Lancelot is the greatest, most heartbreaking creation. An ugly, self-loathing, and deeply insecure man who prays to God to be allowed to perform a miracle, and who, in his purity, is only to fall in love with Guinevere 5 minutes later. He is a man at war with his own beast. And Arthur, his king, is a man who loves them both, his best friend and his wife, and is trapped, watching them destroy his dream and loving them too much to stop it. By the end, on the eve of the Battle of Camlan, Arthur is an old, broken, and deeply sad man. His dream is in ruins. But in a final, beautiful scene, he meets a young page, a boy named Tom, who still believes in the idea of the Round Table. And Arthur, in his last act, knights the boy and commands him to run from the battle, to go home, and to tell the story. He has failed. But the idea, the dream of civilization, of justice, of might for right, is passed on. It is an idea, White tells us, that is like a candle, one that can be carried, even in the wind, from one generation to the next. White had saved the king. He had made him a flawed, tragic, modern, humanist hero. His book, adapted into the 1960s Disney film and the 1960s Broadway musical Camelot, which became the defining symbol for the lost, idealized Kennedy presidency, became the popular, dominant, 20th century version of the myth. He had taken the candle from Tennyson and passed it on. That candle, the one D.H. White's old sad King Arthur passed to a young boy on the eve of his final battle, is the perfect and perhaps final metaphor for the legend itself. The man was gone. The kingdom was in ruins. The dream was a failure. And yet, the story was saved, carried away from the battlefield, to be told and retold, lit and relit, a single flickering flame to be held up against the darkness of whatever present day it found itself in. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, that flame did not just survive, it became a wildfire. The king, having been made human by T.H. White, was now finally ready for everyone. He became a piece of cultural open source code, a story so powerful and so universal that it could be endlessly remixed, rebooted, and reimagined. A myth for a new, media-saturated, and deeply fractured age. This, in its own way, is the final mainstream fact of our long journey. The persistence of the myth is no longer in doubt. You cannot, in the Western world, go a single year without a new King Arthur. He is everywhere. He is the dark, psychosexual, and visually stunning fever dream of John Bowman's 1981 film Excalibur, a movie that tried to cram all of Mallory's violence, magic, and tragedy into 2 terrifying, beautiful hours. He is the target of history's most brilliant satire in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, a film that understood, with a gentle, anarchic absurdity, that the medieval world was probably less about chivalry and more about coconuts. He is the subject of gritty, historical demystification as in Bernard Cornwell's masterful Warlord Chronicles, which takes us all the way back to the beginning, stripping away the magic and the armor to give us a brutal, complex, and deeply plausible 5th century warlord. He is the blank space in a story reframed by the women he sidelined in Marion Zimmer Bradley's revolutionary 1983 novel, The Mists of Avalon, which retold the entire saga not from the Hall of Camelot, but from the perspective of Morgan Le Fay, turning the evil sorceress into a tragic pagan priestess, the hero of her own life. The legend has become a superhero blockbuster, a teen drama on television, a video game, a graphic novel. It has been used to sell everything from cars to insurance. The king is no longer just a king, he is a brand. And this leads us, finally, to the last and perhaps greatest historiographic mystery of all. Why? Why this story? Why not the far more historically verifiable Charlemagne, or the equally poetic Roland? Why not the ancient English sadness of Beowulf, or the grand national epic of El Cid in Spain? Why has this misty, muddy 5th century maybe, this king who wasn't there, become the single most dominant and enduring myth of Western civilization? The hypothesis, and it is the most powerful one, is that the story survives precisely because it is not true. It is not anchored to a single, hard, historical reality. Its very emptiness, the empty shelf we began with, is its greatest strength. It is a hollow crown, and every generation is invited to place it on the head of the king it needs. The legend is not a story. It is a mirror. The 12th century, remember, was desperate for a new kind of hero, a chivalric knight. And so the French poets looked into the mirror and saw Lancelot. The 13th century monks were terrified of that new, adulterous passion, and so they looked in the mirror and saw the pure spiritual rejection of it in Galahad. The 15th century Sir Thomas Malory, a prisoner in a brutal civil war, looked in the mirror and saw a tragic, nostalgic, and deeply human lament for a lost brotherhood. The 19th century Victorians, anxious about their new, ugly industrial world, looked in the mirror and saw a blameless moral statue, a model of duty and restraint. The 20th century T.H. White, haunted by the rise of fascism, looked in the mirror and saw a humanist, anti-war parable. And our own cynical, postmodern age looks in the mirror and sees what? A flawed, gritty anti-hero, a story of the women who were silenced, a chance to deconstruct the whole beautiful and problematic lie. The story persists because it contains all our stories. It is the primal myth, the one that has everything. It has the boy who would be king, the foundling hero who pulls the sword from the stone. It has the wise, magical mentor in Merlin. It has the perfect, tragic love triangle. It has the deep, unshakable bond of brotherhood in the Round Table. It has the dark, familial betrayal in Mordred. It has the great spiritual crisis in the Grail. And most importantly, it has that last, immortal promise. A promise of a second chance. A promise that the end is not the end. We went looking all those hours ago for a king. We went chasing the ghost of a 5th century warlord through the damp, dark age forests of a collapsed Roman province. We hunted for his real battles, his real court, his real grave. But the real Arthur was never the point. The historical Arthur is a fascinating academic puzzle, a ghost on an empty shelf. But the legendary Arthur, he is real. He is more real than the man he may or may not have been. He is the embodiment of a single, simple, and desperately human idea. The dream that we can build a better world, a place of justice, equality, and meaning, if only for a little while. And the knowledge that when we, in our flawed, human, and tragic way, inevitably fail, the story will not be over. The barge, black and silent, floats away from the shore. The last night, Bedivere is left, weeping, in the world of men. The dream has faded, but the promise remains. Rex quondam, rexque futurus, the once king and the future king. The dream is not dead. It is only sleeping. It is waiting, just beyond the mist, in the quiet green vale of Avalon. It is waiting for us.